The backyard was filled with laughter, the smell of grilled meat, and the sound of my family having the time of their lives. Then, my sister raised her glass and announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "Honestly, if you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice." The entire table erupted in laughter. My parents, my cousins, even my brother-in-law who I'd helped move into their house just last month. I sat there fork frozen, halfway to my mouth, watching them laugh at my expense, like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. So I raised my drink, smiled, and said 2 words that would change everything, challenge accepted. That night I packed my bags, froze every joint account I was tied to, deleted my social media, changed my number, and disappeared without a trace. They thought I was a joke, someone they could mock and dismiss and forget. But 1 year later, I'm the one thriving while they're scrambling to figure out where everything went wrong. Because when you erase someone from your life as a joke, don't be surprised when they make it permanent. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll see exactly how sweet revenge can taste when it's served ice cold. My name is Melissa Gray. I'm 33 years old and I work as a senior accountant for a firm based in Los Angeles, though I've been working remotely for the past 5 years. I've always been the dependable one, the quiet one, the daughter who shows up when she's supposed to and doesn't make waves. But dependable, I've learned, is just another word for forgettable. The July heat in San Diego was brutal that afternoon, the kind that makes the air shimmer above the pavement and turns every surface too hot to touch. My parents' backyard was packed with family for the annual summer barbecue, a tradition my mother Linda had been hosting for as long as I could remember. She stood by the grill with my father overseeing the burgers and hot dogs with the careful attention she reserved for events where people might judge her. My younger sister, Samantha, held court at the patio table, surrounded by aunts and cousins who hung on her every word, like she was dispensing wisdom instead of gossip. I sat at the far end of the table with a plate of potato salad. I wasn't eating, watching the family. I'd driven 3 hours to see act like I wasn't there. It wasn't new, it was just another variation of a pattern I'd known my entire life. Samantha was the sun around which everyone orbited. Beautiful, charming, effortlessly magnetic in ways I'd never been. My mother doted on her, asked about her job in real estate, complimented her dress, her hair, the way she laughed. When she looked at me, if she looked at me at all, it was with the vague acknowledgement you'd give a piece of furniture that had always been there and always would be. "Melissa, pass the rolls, ma'am," someone said, and I did my hand briefly visible before disappearing back into irrelevance. Samantha was telling a story about a difficult client. Her voice animated her hands gesturing dramatically. Everyone laughed at the punchline. Then she turned her eyes, landing on me with the kind of look that meant trouble was coming. "You know what I realised the other day?" she said loud enough that conversations around the table started to fade. "If Melissa disappeared tomorrow, literally no one would even notice." The words hung in the air for a beat. Then someone laughed. Then someone else. Within seconds, the entire table was roaring, my mother wiping tears from her eyes, my father shaking his head like it was the cleverest observation he'd ever heard. My aunt reached over and patted Samantha's hand. "Oh, honey, that's terrible," she said, but she was still laughing. I sat there, my face burning, my hands clenched in my lap. I looked around the table at all these people I'd known my entire life, and not one of them was defending me. Not one of them thought the joke had gone too far. They were too busy, enjoying it, except for Grandpa Walter. He sat across from me, his weathered face serious, his eyes on mine. He wasn't laughing. He looked sad, almost apologetic, like he wanted to say something, but didn't know how. I gave him a small nod, letting him know I was okay, even though I wasn't. I picked up my glass of iced tea, raised it slightly, and looked directly at Samantha. "Challenge accepted," I said. She blinked confused, then laughed again. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. I just smiled, took a sip, and set the glass down. The conversation moved on. The laughter resumed, and I sat there planning my exit in a way none of them would see coming. That night, at 2 a.m., I drove away from San Diego, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I know what you did, Sam." I drove north on the 5, the highway empty at this hour, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The note I'd left would be found in the morning, and Samantha would know immediately what it meant. Or at least she'd know I knew. Whether she'd understand how much I knew or what I planned to do about it, that was another matter entirely. As the miles disappeared behind me, I thought about all the moments that had led here, the accumulated weight of 33 years of being invisible in my own family. It wasn't just the joke at the barbecue. That was simply the final public articulation of something that had always been true. I was 8 years old the first time I realised I was forgettable. My birthday fell on a Tuesday that year, and I'd spent the whole day at school excited about the cake my mother had promised to make. When I got home, the house was empty, except for a note saying they'd taken Samantha to her dance recital and would be back late. There was leftover pizza in the fridge. My birthday cake never materialised. The next day, when I reminded my mother, she looked genuinely surprised and said, "Oh, honey, was that yesterday? I'm sorry. It just slipped into my mind." It happened again when I was 12. And 16. By the time I turned 21, I stopped expecting anything and wasn't disappointed when nothing came. The achievements were worse than the forgotten birthdays, though, because those I'd worked for. I graduated high school with honours 3rd in my class. Samantha had graduated 2 years earlier with a C average, and my parents had thrown her a party with 100 guests. For me, there was a card and a cheque for $50. When I got accepted to UCLA with a partial scholarship, my mother said, "That's nice, dear," and went back to helping Samantha pick out furniture for her first apartment. I learned to shrink my expectations, to celebrate my wins privately, to stop looking for validation from people who'd never learned to see me. But I never stopped achieving. I got my accounting degree, passed my CPA exam, on the first try, built a solid career. I did it all quietly, without fanfare, because fanfare had never been available to me anyway. But when I was 25, I'd had an idea I actually believed in. I'd spent 6 months developing a detailed business plan for a financial consulting service I called Family First Financial. The concept was simple, affordable financial planning, specifically designed for families with a focus on making complex financial decisions, accessible to people who couldn't afford high-end advisors. I'd researched the market, built financial projections, even designed a logo. I'd poured everything into it, stayed up late after work, sacrificed weekends. I'd shown it to my family at a Sunday dinner, the only time I'd ever actively sought their attention. I'd brought printed copies of the business plan, handed them out, explained the concept with more enthusiasm than I usually allowed myself. My mother had glanced at the first page and set it aside. My father had nodded politely and changed the subject. But Samantha had taken hers home. 6 months later, she'd announced she was launching her own business, Family First Consulting. Same concept, same target market, same basic structure I'd outlined in my plan. She'd even used a nearly identical name. When I'd confronted her privately, she'd looked at me with wide, innocent eyes and said, "What are you talking about? I came up with this idea months ago. You must have misunderstood what I was working on." I'd shown my parents the business plan with my name on it, dated 8 months earlier. They'd suggested that maybe Samantha and I had been thinking along similar lines independently. "Great minds think alike," my mother had said, smiling at Samantha. I'd looked at my sister then and seen something I'd never noticed before. She wasn't just indifferent to my pain, she was pleased by it. The only person who'd believed me was Grandpa Walter. He'd pulled me aside after that dinner and said, "I know what she did, Melissa. I've known for a long time that your sister has a talent for taking credit for other people's work." He'd paused, his old hand steady on my shoulders. "I keep an old tape recorder in my office, have for years, because I learned a long time ago that recordings don't lie even when people do." At the time, I thought it was just his way of saying he believed me. Now I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something more specific, something about documenting truth before it could be rewritten. Samantha's business had thrived, of course. She had the charisma, the connections, the family support I'd never received. She'd built it into something successful while I watched from the sidelines, and no one except Walter ever acknowledged where the idea had really come from. For years, I told myself that was the worst thing she'd done to me, that stealing my business concept and getting away with it was the ultimate betrayal. I'd learned to live with it, to move on, to accept that some injustices never get corrected. But the stolen business idea was just the surface. What Melissa discovered 8 months before the BBQ would justify everything she was about to do. 8 months ago, on a grey November morning, everything changed. I'd been working from my apartment in Los Angeles when the mail arrived. Most of it was the usual bills and junk, but one envelope caught my attention because the address was wrong. It was meant for my parents' house in San Diego, but had been delivered to me instead, probably because my name was on it. The return address was from a bank I'd never done business with. I opened it without thinking much about it. It was a statement for a credit card account in my name showing a balance of $43,000. I stared at the numbers, my coffee growing cold in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't opened this account. I didn't even recognize the bank. That's when I noticed the billing address listed on the statement. It wasn't my apartment in LA, it was my parents' house in San Diego. The same house where Samantha still lived, having moved back in 2 years earlier to save money while building her business. I called the bank. Then, I called 2 other banks whose customer service numbers I found by searching my name online. By the end of that day, I'd discovered 5 separate credit accounts opened in my name over the past 3 years. Credit cards, personal loans, a line of credit. The total was over $120,000, and I hadn't signed for a single one of them. The accounts had been opened using my social security number, my date of birth, and my mother's maiden name, standard security questions I'd never thought to protect, because who expects their own family to steal from them? The addresses were all variations: my parents' house, a P.O. box I'd never rented, even my old college address from a decade ago. Someone had been careful rotating the addresses to avoid detection, making payments just often enough to keep the accounts from defaulting, while continuing to rack up charges. I knew immediately it was Samantha. She was the only one with access to all my personal information, the only one who lived at the address where most of the statements were being sent, the only one with both the motive and the moral flexibility to do something like this. She'd stolen my business idea and faced no consequences. Why wouldn't she steal my identity too? I spent 3 days gathering documentation, printing statements, tracking down every fraudulent account I could find. Then, I made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in financial crimes. His name was Richard Moss, and he had a small office in downtown LA with walls covered in framed law degrees and certificates. I showed him everything. He listened carefully, made notes, asked detailed questions about my relationship with my family. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Here's your problem," he said. "This is identity theft, yes. It's a crime. But it's within your family, and that complicates everything. If you press charges, it becomes a he said, she said situation. Your sister will claim you gave her permission, or that it was a misunderstanding, or that you're the one who opened the accounts and forgot. Your parents will back her up. It will be messy, expensive, and there is no guarantee you will win." "So I just let her get away with it?" I asked, feeling the familiar weight of resignation settling over me. "I didn't say that." He pulled out a legal pad and started writing. "Did your sister claim any of these expenses as business deductions?" I thought about it. Samantha's business, the one built on my stolen idea, had been growing rapidly. She'd been traveling frequently, buying equipment, hosting client events. "Probably," I said. "She writes off everything she can." "Then, here's what you do," Richard said, pushing the legal pad toward me. "Forget pressing charges directly. Focus on the tax fraud. If she used your identity to open these accounts and then claimed the expenses as business deductions, she's committed tax fraud. And the IRS doesn't care about family dynamics. They care about money, and they're very good at getting it back. He'd outlined a strategy: gather every piece of evidence I could find. Document not just the fraudulent accounts, but any evidence of Samantha using those accounts for business purposes and claiming deductions she wasn't entitled to. Build a case so airtight that when the IRS audited her, there would be no room for explanation or excuse. But here's the thing, he'd said, looking at me seriously. Once you start this, there's no going back. The IRS doesn't operate on family loyalty. They'll pursue this to the end. Are you prepared for what that means? I'd looked at him and realised I'd been prepared for this my entire life. I'd just been waiting for the right reason. For the next 8 months, I became a detective of my own life. I requested credit reports, tracked purchases, cross-referenced dates with Samantha's social media posts where she'd bragged about client dinners and business trips. I documented everything in a password-protected file, building a timeline that showed not just the theft, but the systematic nature of it. She hadn't just stolen from me once. She'd been doing it for years, using my credit to fund her lifestyle and her business, while I paid my own bills and lived modestly. I also prepared my exit. I had 2 joint accounts with my parents' relics from college when they'd insisted on having access in case of emergency. Over the years, I'd contributed about $30,000 to those accounts, money that was supposed to be for family expenses, but mostly seemed to benefit Samantha. I quietly withdrew it all, moving the money into a new account they didn't know about. I bought a prepaid phone and gave the number only to my boss and 2 close friends who weren't connected to my family. I started working more remotely, creating distance without anyone noticing. And I went to see Grandpa Walter. He was the only one who'd ever believed me, the only one who'd seen through Samantha's charm to the manipulation underneath. I met him at his small house in Carlsbad 3 days before the barbecue. He made coffee, and we sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd told me recordings don't lie. I gave him a USB drive. "This is everything," I said. Bank statements, credit reports, purchase records, tax documents I managed to access. Everything that proves what Samantha did. He held the small drive carefully like it was precious. "What do you want me to do with it?" "Wait a week after I leave," I said. "Then send it to the IRS. There's a cover letter in there and contact information for the lawyer who helped me compile it. But give me a week head start first. I need time to disappear completely before the hammer falls." "Where will you go?" he asked. "Somewhere they can't find me. Somewhere I can finally be someone other than the forgotten daughter." I paused. "I'll contact you when I'm settled. But Grandpa, this is important. You're the only person who can't know where I am, because you're the only person they might actually ask. I need you to be able to honestly say you don't know." He'd nodded, his eyes wet. "You know they're going to say you're the bad guy in this." "They already think I'm nothing," I said. "I'd rather be a villain than invisible." The barbecue had been my final performance, my last chance to see if anyone would notice me defend me, acknowledge that the joke was cruel. When they laughed, instead I knew I'd made the right choice. I left at 2 a.m. For the next 14 days, my phone sat on the kitchen counter, still on, and not one person called to check on her. The coastal Oregon town I chose had a population of just under 3,000 people, the kind of place where the main street had more antique shops than chain stores, and everyone knew the baker by name. I'd picked it randomly from a map looking for somewhere small enough to disappear into, but large enough that a newcomer wouldn't be immediate gossip. The town was called Bayshore, and it sat perched on cliffs overlooking the Pacific, grey and moody and beautiful in a way that matched how I felt inside. I rented a room in a converted Victorian house on the edge of town for $600 a month. It was small, just enough space for a bed, a desk and a narrow closet, but the window looked out over the ocean, and the landlady, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, asked no questions beyond first and last month's rent. I paid in cash from the emergency fund I'd built over 8 months of careful planning. $53,000, a combination of my withdrawn contributions from the joint accounts, my savings, and a small severance package from my accounting firm, when I'd resigned with 2 weeks' notice, citing personal reasons they hadn't pressed me to explain. The money would last me a year, maybe longer, if I was careful. But I didn't want to just hide and wait for my resources to run out. I wanted to build something new, something that was entirely mine. So 3 days after I arrived, I walked into Rose's bakery on Main Street and asked if they were hiring. The owner, a woman named Rose Delacroix, who looked to be in her late 60s, studied me with sharp brown eyes that seemed to see more than I wanted to show. She was small and compact, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands dusted with flour. "You ever worked in a bakery before?" she asked. "No," I admitted. "But I'm good with numbers, I show up on time, and I'm willing to learn." She smiled at that, a slight curve of her mouth that suggested she'd heard a lot of promises in her time, and learned to judge people by actions rather than words. "Start tomorrow at 5 a.m, minimum wage, but you keep your tips and you can eat whatever doesn't sell at the end of the day. We'll see how it goes." I showed up at 4:55 the next morning and didn't miss a shift for the next 3 months. The work was physical in ways my accounting job had never been, kneading dough and hauling flour sacks and standing on my feet for 8-hour shifts. But it was also meditative. There was a rhythm to it, a simplicity that let my mind rest in ways it hadn't in years. Rose taught me to measure ingredients by feel as much as by weight, to judge when bread was ready, by the sound it made when you tapped the crust to read customers, by how they ordered shy people getting extra kindness and demanding ones getting firm boundaries. She didn't ask about my past, didn't press when I deflected personal questions, but she watched me with a grandmother's attention, noticing when I'd been crying before my shift, or when I zoned out staring at the ocean during slow afternoon hours. About 6 weeks into working for her, she set a cup of coffee in front of me during our break and said, "You running from something or towards something?" I'd hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Both, I think." "Good answer," she'd said, sipping her own coffee. "Running from something alone just means you're always looking over your shoulder. But if you're running towards something too, at least you've got a direction." She'd paused, studying me. "You waiting for someone to give you permission to start over?" "Maybe," I'd admitted. "Then here's your permission from an old lady who started over more times than you've had birthdays. You don't need anyone else to believe in you. If you wait for others to believe in you, you'll wait forever. But if you believe in yourself, the world will follow. Not right away, maybe, but eventually." She tapped my hand gently. "Whatever you left behind, whatever hurt you're carrying, it doesn't get to define who you become next. That's your choice, not theirs." Those words had settled into me like seeds in fertile ground. I'd spent so many years waiting for my family to see me, to value me, to give me the recognition I thought I needed to matter. But Rose was right. Their validation was never coming, and I didn't need it anymore. I just needed to believe in my own worth, to build a life where I wasn't waiting for someone else's approval to exist. I started journaling every night, sitting at the small desk in my rented room, with the sound of ocean waves drifting through the open window. I wrote about the memories that still haunted me, the birthday parties that didn't happen, and the achievements that went unacknowledged. I wrote about Samantha's laugh when she made her joke about my mother's indifference about the business plan I'd poured my heart into only to watch her steal it. And I wrote about the fraud of the $120,000 of debt she'd loaded onto my name, the casual cruelty of using me as a financial resource while treating me as less than human. But I also wrote about the sunrise I'd watched from the cliffs on my second day in Bayshore, about the satisfaction of pulling a perfect loaf of bread from the oven, about the elderly man who came in every Tuesday for a cinnamon roll and always told me I had a kind smile. I wrote about Rose's wisdom and Mrs. Chen's quiet acceptance, and the way the ocean made me feel small in a good way, like my problems were just tiny pieces of a much larger, more beautiful world. Slowly, I began to heal. Not completely, not in any neat, linear way that meant I was done processing the pain. But I started to feel like a person again instead of just a wound. I started to imagine a future that wasn't defined by what had been taken from me. Then about 3 months into my new life, just as peace seemed possible, a man named Ethan started coming to the bakery. Every single day, always sitting in the corner watching her. At first, I'd been suspicious. Years of being invisible had made me hypersensitive to being noticed. And a man who came in every single day ordered the same medium coffee and blueberry muffin and sat in the same corner booth watching me work felt like a threat. I'd learnt the hard way that attention from my family meant I was about to be used or dismissed. Attention from strangers felt equally dangerous, like being seen meant being vulnerable to whatever they wanted to take. But Ethan never asked for anything beyond his coffee and muffin. He didn't try to chat me up or make uncomfortable small talk. He'd just sit there with a worn paperback, occasionally glancing up when I refilled the pastry case, or wiped down tables, offering a small smile that never felt predatory or demanding. After 2 weeks of this routine, Rose had leaned over during a slow afternoon and whispered, "He's harmless, moved here about 6 months ago, retired teacher, keeps to himself mostly." Then why does he keep staring at me? I'd asked, more defensive than I'd intended. Rose had given me one of her knowing looks. Maybe because you're worth looking at, and maybe because he recognises something in you that he sees in himself. Before I could ask what she meant, she'd gone back to ringing up a customer, leaving me with that cryptic observation. It was a rainy Thursday morning, the kind of Pacific Northwest rain that felt less like weather and more like a permanent state of being when Ethan finally spoke to me beyond his usual order. I was wiping down the table next to his booth when he closed his book and said, "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable. I promise I'm not trying to be creepy." I'd frozen cloth in hand, caught between suspicion and curiosity. "Then what are you trying to be?" "Honestly, I'm trying to remember how to be around people again." He'd smiled, self-deprecating and tired in a way that felt genuine. "I'm Ethan, by the way. Ethan Moore. I taught high school English for 20 years before I retired early. Or got pushed into early retirement, depending on how you want to frame a messy divorce." Something in his honesty made me lower my guard slightly. I sat down across from him, still holding the cleaning cloth like a security blanket. "Melissa," I'd said, offering only my first name. "Nice to officially meet you, Melissa." He gestured to the window where rain streaked down the glass. "You're not from here originally, are you?" "Neither am I. There's a specific look that transplants have in small coastal towns, like we're all refugees from bigger, louder lives that didn't work out the way we planned." "Is that what you are?" I'd asked. "A refugee." "Something like that." He'd taken a sip of his coffee, considering his words carefully. My ex-wife was brilliant and ambitious and made me feel small in ways I didn't recognise until I was so diminished I barely recognised myself. When she left, everyone told me I should fight for the marriage, that I should try harder, be better. But I realised I'd been trying for years, and it was never going to be enough. So, I took my pension, packed up, and came here to figure out who I was, when I wasn't constantly trying to prove I deserved to exist in someone else's life. His words hit me like a physical thing so close to my own experience that I'd felt tears prick my eyes. I'd looked away trying to compose myself, but he'd noticed. "I'm sorry," he'd said quickly. That was too much. I have a terrible habit of oversharing when I'm nervous." "No," I'd managed, looking back at him. "It's just that I understand what you mean. About feeling small, about trying to prove you deserve to exist." That had been the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Ethan continued his daily visits, and slowly, carefully, we began to talk. Not about specifics at first, just about the experience of starting over, about the strange freedom and terror of building a life with no one watching, no one judging, no one waiting for you to fail. He told me about his divorce, about his ex-wife who'd been a successful lawyer, and had eventually decided he wasn't ambitious enough, interesting enough worth keeping. He told me about the years he'd spent trying to be someone she could be proud of, shrinking his own dreams to fit the shape of hers. I found myself sharing more than I'd intended, more than I'd shared with anyone except Rose. I told him I'd had a family who'd never seen me a sister, who'd betrayed my trust in ways that went beyond typical sibling rivalry. I didn't give him details, didn't mention the fraud, or the stolen business idea, or the decades of being forgotten. But I told him enough that he understood I was running from something, and he never pushed for more. Second chapters, he'd said one afternoon, raising his coffee cup like a toast. That's what we're both writing. The great thing about second chapters is you get to decide who you are this time. No one else's expectations, no one else's definitions. Just you figuring out what actually matters. For the first time in my life, I felt seen without having to prove my worth. Ethan didn't need me to be impressive or accomplished or entertaining. He just appreciated me as I was, a woman serving coffee and learning to make bread and trying to heal from wounds I'd carried so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like not to hurt. There was no romance between us, nothing that felt like it was leading toward anything beyond friendship. But that friendship was more valuable than I'd known friendship could be. He was proof that not everyone would use my vulnerability against me, that some people actually meant it when they said they cared. We started taking walks along the cliffs after my shifts ended, talking about books and teaching and the specific quality of light that made Oregon sunsets feel like a secret the rest of the world hadn't discovered. He told me about the students he'd loved teaching, about the moment he'd realised he couldn't keep giving pieces of himself to a marriage that only took and never gave back. I told him about working in accounting, about the satisfaction of making numbers balance, about the small apartment in Los Angeles I'd left behind without a second glance. One evening, about a month into our friendship, we sat on a bench overlooking the ocean and he'd said, "You know what I admire about you? You're building something real here. You're not waiting for permission or approval, you're just doing it. That takes courage most people don't have." I'd thought about all the years I'd waited for my family to see me, to acknowledge me, to give me the validation I thought I needed to matter. And I realised Ethan was right. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was building a life that was entirely mine, and for the first time ever, that felt like enough. Meanwhile, 900 miles south in San Diego, Melissa's family finally realised something was very, very wrong. I didn't learn what was happening back in San Diego until much later, through a combination of Walter's careful updates and my own detective work, but the timeline of their panic became clear enough. For 2 weeks after I left my phone, sat on the kitchen counter where I deliberately abandoned it, charged and turned on a test I knew they'd fail. Not one call, not one text, not a single person in my family noticed I was gone until the banks forced them to pay attention. It was my mother who discovered it first, apparently. She'd gone to transfer money from one of the joint accounts we shared, the ones I'd contributed to for years, and found the balance sitting at exactly zero. She'd called the bank confused, thinking there'd been some kind of error or fraud. The customer service representative had calmly explained that the account holder, Melissa Gray, had withdrawn all funds and removed Linda Gray's authorization 2 weeks prior. My mother had done the same thing with the second account and gotten the same answer. That's when she'd finally looked for me. Finally called my phone and heard it ringing from the kitchen counter. Finally noticed that my car was gone, that my room looked cleaned out, that the daughter she'd spent 33 years ignoring had actually left. Walter told me later that the panic in that house had been immediate and chaotic. My mother had called Samantha, who'd rushed over from her apartment across town. They'd found my note on the counter, those 5 words that I'd laboured over for hours before finally settling on their elegant simplicity. "I know what you did, Sam." Samantha had apparently gone white, according to Walter, who'd been called over for what my mother termed a family emergency. She'd insisted the note meant nothing, that I was probably just being dramatic, that I'd always been unstable and jealous of her success. But Walter said her hands had been shaking as she held the paper, and she'd asked too quickly if anyone had checked my laptop or looked through my room for any documents I might have taken. The financial panic was real enough. $30,000 was a significant chunk of money, especially since my parents had been counting on those joint accounts as their backup emergency fund. They'd been using my contributions for years, treating my money as communal property while keeping their own finances separate. Now it was gone, and they were left scrambling to cover expenses they'd planned around funds that were no longer available. But Samantha's panic was different. It was strategic. Within 48 hours of discovering I was gone, she'd begun her damage control campaign, and I had to admit it was masterful in its calculated cruelty. She started with phone calls to mutual friends, people we'd known growing up, distant cousins and family friends. Her story was consistent and carefully crafted. Melissa had been struggling for a while, showing signs of instability, becoming increasingly jealous of Samantha's business success. She'd been acting erratically, making accusations that didn't make sense, possibly dealing with depression or even a breakdown. "I'm so worried about her," Samantha had told person after person, her voice perfectly pitched between concern and resignation. "She's always been sensitive, but lately she's been saying things that just aren't true, making up stories about me, about the family. I think she might be having some kind of mental health crisis." The narrative was brilliant because it accomplished three things simultaneously. It made Samantha look like the caring, concerned sister. It preemptively discredited anything I might say or any evidence I might present. And it gave the family a socially acceptable explanation for my disappearance that didn't require them to examine their own behaviour. Within a week, Samantha had taken to social media. Her Facebook post was a masterpiece of performative concern. "Praying for my sister during her mental health struggles. If you're reading this, Melissa, we love you and want you to get the help you need. As mental health matters. Family first, praying for you." The post got hundreds of reactions, dozens of comments from people offering prayers and support, telling Samantha what a good sister she was for being so understanding and compassionate. She tagged me in it, knowing my account was dormant, knowing I wouldn't see it or respond. The silence would only reinforce her narrative that I was unstable and isolating myself. My mother had adopted a similar strategy in her social circles. When people asked where I was, she'd sigh and say, "I was travelling, trying to find myself," with an expression that suggested she was indulging a troubled daughter's need for space. But the subtext was clear in her tone. Melissa was always difficult, always needing something, always causing problems. This was just another example of me being dramatic and unreliable. Publicly, they maintained this facade of concerned family members worried about an unstable relative. Privately, Walter told me they'd hired a private investigator within 3 days of discovering I was gone. Not because they wanted to make sure I was safe, not because they loved me or missed me, but because they needed to know what I'd taken with me, what I knew, what evidence I might have gathered. The investigator's name was Marcus Webb, and he'd been recommended by Samantha's lawyer, which should have told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. He'd started by going through my apartment in Los Angeles, talking to my former boss, checking my bank records and credit card statements. He'd found the prepaid phone purchase, the careful withdrawal of funds, the resignation from my job that I'd planned weeks in advance. His report, which I'd eventually get my hands on, concluded that I'd left deliberately and with significant premeditation, which meant this wasn't a breakdown or a crisis. This was intentional disappearance. That's when Samantha had really started to worry. A mentally unstable sister who vanished on impulse was one thing. She could be managed, controlled, brought back and dismissed as unreliable. But a sister who'd planned her exit for months, who'd withdrawn funds and cut ties and left a note that said, "I know what you did," that was a threat that required a different kind of response. My parents seemed primarily concerned with the money and the social embarrassment of having a daughter who'd vanished. They wanted me found so they could manage the narrative, so they could prove to their friends and neighbours that they were good parents dealing with a troubled child. But Samantha's motivation was darker and more urgent. She wasn't looking to bring me home safely. She was looking to find out what I knew, what evidence I had, and how much damage I could do to the life she'd built on stolen foundations. Because Samantha understood something my parents didn't quite grasp yet. The note I'd left wasn't a cry for help or an emotional outburst. It was a declaration of war. And in any war, the first step is understanding what weapons your enemy has at their disposal. But Samantha wasn't looking to bring Melissa home safely. She was looking to find out what Melissa knew. Walter had promised to give me a week before sending the evidence to the IRS, but I told him to wait 3 weeks instead, a strategic decision I'd made during one of our planning sessions. Let them panic first, I'd said. Let them hire investigators and spin their stories and think they're getting ahead of it. Then, pull the rug out. He'd nodded, understanding immediately that sometimes the most devastating blow is the one that comes just when your enemy thinks they're safe. 3 weeks and 2 days after I left San Diego, a thick manila envelope arrived at the IRS field office in Los Angeles. There was no return address, just a typed label addressed to the Fraud Investigation Unit, and a note inside that read, "Enclosed is evidence of systematic tax fraud committed by Samantha Gray, owner of Family First Consulting, San Diego, California. All documentation is authentic and can be independently verified." The envelope contained everything my lawyer Richard Moss and I had compiled over 8 months. Copies of the fraudulent credit accounts opened in my name, cross-referenced with expense reports Samantha had filed with her business. Forged contracts with clients who didn't exist, fake invoices for services never rendered, evidence of shadow accounts she'd used to hide income while claiming poverty-level earnings for tax purposes. Most damning were the falsified tax returns spanning 4 years, showing how she'd claimed business expenses that were actually personal purchases made on my stolen credit, effectively getting tax deductions for fraud. Richard had structured the package brilliantly, organising it like a prosecutor's case file, each section building on the last, making it impossible to dismiss as confusion or honest mistake. This was systematic, deliberate fraud, documented across multiple years with clear evidence of intent. The kind of case IRS investigators loved because it was gift-wrapped and ready for prosecution. I learned later through Walter's careful updates that the IRS letter had arrived at Samantha's office exactly 1 week after they received the anonymous package. She'd been meeting with a client when her assistant brought in the certified mail, and she'd made the mistake of opening it right there in front of someone who could witness her reaction. The letter was professionally cold, the kind of bureaucratic language that carries more weight than any threats could. Preliminary civil examination of Family First, Consulting and Samantha Gray, individual taxpayer. The Internal Revenue Service has received information suggesting potential tax fraud and false reporting. You are hereby notified that a preliminary civil examination will be conducted. You are required to provide the following documentation within 30 days of receipt of this letter, or this matter will be escalated to the Criminal Investigation Division. The list of requested documents that followed was extensive and specific. Bank statements for all business and personal accounts, copies of all filed tax returns for the past 5 years, original contracts and invoices for every client listed on her business tax filings, documentation of all claimed business expenses, including receipts and proof of payment, credit card statements for any cards used for business purposes. It was the last item that had made Samantha's hands shake, according to her assistant who'd later quit, and happened to mention the incident to a mutual acquaintance who'd mentioned it to Walter. Credit card statements for any cards used for business purposes. Because, of course, many of those cards were in my name, opened fraudulently, used to fund her lifestyle while she claimed them as business expenses, and got tax deductions for money she'd stolen. The letter concluded with the particularly terrifying phrase, "Failure to provide complete and accurate documentation may result in criminal prosecution for tax evasion fraud and related charges. The IRS takes these matters seriously and will pursue all available legal remedies." Samantha had excused herself from the client meeting, locked herself in her office and called her lawyer within 5 minutes. Then she'd called my parents. Then, in a move I found particularly satisfying when I learned about it, she'd driven directly to Walter's house and confronted him. He'd been expecting her, he told me later during one of our careful phone calls on my prepaid line. He'd been sitting on his porch when she'd pulled up her car door, slamming hard enough that the neighbours looked out their windows. She'd stormed up his driveway with the IRS letter in her hand, her face red with fury and fear. "You sent it," she'd said, not even bothering with pretense. "Melissa gave you something before she left, and you sent it to the IRS." Walter had taken a sip of his iced tea, taking his time before responding. "I don't know what you're talking about, Samantha." "Don't lie to me. She gave you evidence and you sent it. You're helping her destroy me." He'd set down his glass and looked at her with an expression I wished I could have seen. Walter had always been mild-mannered, the family peacemaker, the one who stayed quiet during conflicts. But something in him had changed after watching what they'd done to me, after learning about the fraud, after years of seeing me diminished while Samantha was celebrated. "I'm not destroying you," he'd said quietly. "You destroyed yourself the moment you decided to steal from your sister and commit federal tax fraud. All I did was make sure the truth reached people who care about truth more than they care about family loyalty." Samantha had threatened him, then said she'd contest the will he'd left me, in that she'd make sure he never saw any of the family again, that she'd turn everyone against him. Walter had just smiled that peaceful smile of an old man who'd lived long enough to stop caring about social consequences. "I'm 88 years old, Samantha. I've got cancer they tell me is manageable, but will probably kill me in 5 years if something else doesn't get me first. I don't have time to care about your threats, but I had enough time to make sure Melissa got the justice she deserved." He'd stood up then, despite his aching knees, and looked down at her. "You stole from her for years. You used her identity, her credit, her ideas, and you never once felt guilty about it. The IRS doesn't care that you're family. They just care that you broke the law. Now get off my property." She'd left, and Walter had called me that night to tell me the IRS package had done its job. "She's panicking," he'd said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Good. She should panic. What she did to you deserves worse than panic, but it's a start." I'd thanked him, told him I loved him, made him promise to take care of his health. After we hung up, I'd sat in my little room above the bakery and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not even satisfaction, more like vindication. The quiet certainty that truth, when properly documented and delivered to the right people, had power even against liars with resources and family protection. The IRS didn't care about Samantha's social media campaign painting me as mentally unstable. They didn't care about my family's explanations or excuses. They cared about numbers, documentation, evidence, and I'd given them all three in abundance. Samantha had 30 days to respond to the IRS. She spent them crafting her most dangerous scheme yet, the forgery trap. I didn't know what Samantha was doing during those 30 days, until it was almost too late. I'd been living in Bayshore for over a month by then, settling into a routine that felt almost peaceful. Working the early morning shift at Rose's bakery, taking walks with Ethan along the cliffs, journaling in the evenings while the ocean wind rattled my windows. I'd started to believe that maybe I'd finally escaped, that the worst was behind me, and all I had to do was wait for the IRS to do its job while I built my new life far away from the wreckage of my old one. I should have known Samantha wouldn't go down quietly. She'd spent her entire life manipulating narratives and escaping consequences. Why would this time be any different? Walter pieced together what she'd done, mostly through conversations with his lawyer friend who had contacts in various legal circles, and through the private investigators' reports, that Samantha had foolishly shared with my parents, not realising Walter would eventually see them. The scheme was elaborate, desperate, and terrifyingly clever in its audacity. First, she'd gained access to my old email account, the one I'd abandoned when I left. I'd never changed the password in years, a security oversight that came back to haunt me. Using that access, Samantha had created an entire email trail dating back 18 months, carefully backdated messages that appeared to show me directing her business operations, instructing her on which fraudulent accounts to open, which fake invoices to create, which expenses to claim. The emails were written in a style that mimicked my professional communication, formal and detail-oriented, the kind of messages an accountant might send to someone they were advising. Per our discussion, open the account with Chase, using the information I provided. One forged email read, "Make sure the billing address matches what we discussed. This will help us maximize the business deductions for Q3." Another, "The client contracts for Henderson and Morrison need to reflect higher amounts than actual. I've attached templates. This is standard industry practice for consulting work." She'd created dozens of these messages, a complete paper trail that painted me as the financial mastermind behind Family First Consulting's fraud, while she was just the naive face of the company, following her brilliant accountant sister's advice. It was a masterful inversion of reality, taking my actual profession and using it against me, suggesting that of course the accountant was the one orchestrating tax fraud, not the charismatic saleswoman everyone loved. But the emails alone wouldn't be enough. Samantha needed physical documentation, something that would hold up under legal scrutiny. So she'd hired a document forger, paying him $10,000 cash to create a partnership agreement dated 3 years prior. The document named me as the founding partner and financial director of Family First Consulting, with Samantha as the junior partner and public face. It included what appeared to be my signature expertly forged, using samples from old birthday cards and family documents my parents had saved. The forger had been good. He'd used paper stock that matched the age had created pen impressions that showed the natural pressure patterns of actual signing, had even artificially aged the document to show the subtle yellowing and wear that 3 years in a file cabinet would create. To a casual observer, or even to a moderately careful one, it would look entirely authentic. Armed with these fabricated documents, Samantha had done 2 things simultaneously. First, she'd filed a civil lawsuit against me for defamation and tortious interference with business relationships. The lawsuit claimed that I'd sabotaged her business by sending false information to the IRS, that I'd stolen proprietary business information, and that I'd made defamatory statements about her to clients and associates. The suit demanded $500,000 in damages and requested an immediate restraining order, preventing me from contacting her clients or making any further false reports to government agencies. The brilliance of the civil suit was its strategic purpose. It wasn't really about winning money from me. It was about forcing me to appear in court to come out of hiding to defend myself in a public forum where she could control the narrative. If I didn't appear, she'd win by default judgment, which she could then use as evidence that I'd refused to defend myself because I was guilty. If I did appear, she'd know where I was and her private investigator would be waiting. Second, and more dangerously, she'd provided all this forged documentation to the IRS as part of her response to their civil examination letter. Her lawyer had crafted a carefully worded statement. My client, Samantha Gray, was operating Family First Consulting under the direction and financial guidance of her sister, Melissa Gray, a professional accountant. Any irregularities in tax filings were the result of following Melissa's advice and instructions, which Samantha believed to be legitimate professional guidance. Ms. Samantha Gray was unaware of any fraudulent activity and believed she was following standard business practices as advised by her sister. She'd attached the forged emails, the fake partnership agreement, and a statement claiming she'd only recently discovered that I'd been using her business to commit fraud while she trusted me as family and as a financial professional. She painted herself as another victim of my manipulation, the trusting sister taken advantage of by the bitter, jealous accountant who'd always resented her success. It was a complete inversion of reality, but It was supported by documents that looked authentic, by a narrative that made logical sense on its surface, and by the fact that I wasn't there to defend myself or provide contrary evidence. The IRS, cautious about family disputes and aware that these cases could get complicated, had apparently decided to investigate both of us rather than just Samantha, which meant I was no longer just a witness providing evidence. I was now a potential suspect in a federal fraud investigation. Walter had called me on my prepaid phone when he learned about the lawsuit, his voice urgent in a way I'd never heard before. "Melissa, she's filed suit against you. She's trying to make you the villain, and she's told the IRS that you were the mastermind." I'd felt the floor drop out from under me. Can she do that? Can she just make up evidence? She already has. And unless you surface to defend yourself, her version becomes the official record. You have 30 days to respond to the civil suit, or she wins by default. The letter had arrived at my parents' house first, where the process server had attempted delivery. When that failed, they'd done a skip trace, found my old apartment in Los Angeles, and finally tracked the summons to a forwarding address I'd foolishly maintained. The landlady at my old building, Mrs. Chen's cousin, coincidentally had forwarded it to Bayshore before I'd thought to tell her not to. I came home from my shift at the bakery to find it wedged in my door, a thick manila envelope with official court stamps and the words that made my stomach turn: "Civil summons failure to appear results in default judgment." While Samantha built her trap, Melissa received a letter that made her blood run cold. "Civil summons failure to appear results in default judgment." I spent 2 days staring at the civil summons, trying to decide what to do. Appearing in court meant revealing where I was walking into Samantha's trap, facing a legal system where she'd already planted forged evidence. Not appearing meant a default judgment. $500,000 I didn't have, and the official court record stating that I'd defamed her and interfered with her business. Either way, she'd found a path to destroy me. I was working the morning shift at Rose's bakery, moving through the motions mechanically, while my mind spun in circles when the bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see Walter standing there. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating from stress and lack of sleep. But then he smiled that familiar, gentle smile, and I knew he was real. "Hello, Melissa," he said quietly. "I hope you don't mind an unannounced visitor." I dropped the coffee pot I'd been holding. It shattered on the floor, hot liquid spreading across the tile, but I didn't care. I rushed around the counter and threw my arms around him. This 88-year-old man who'd driven 900 miles because I needed him, and I started crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since I'd left San Diego. Rose came out from the back, took one look at the scene and said, "Take your break, honey. Take as long as you need." She grabbed a mop and started cleaning up the spilled coffee, while Walter guided me to a corner booth, the same one where Ethan always sat. "How did you find me?" I asked when I could finally speak. "You left a phone number with your lawyer friend, Richard Moss." I called him, explained who I was, and he gave me this address. Said you'd probably need family right about now, and he trusted me to be the right kind of family. Walter's hands were shaking slightly as he held mine. The drive had been long for a man his age, and I could see the exhaustion in his face, but his eyes were clear and determined. "You shouldn't have come," I said. "If Samantha finds out you know where I am, she'll use it against you." "Samantha can't do anything worse to me than what I've already decided to do to myself." He pulled a small USB drive from his jacket pocket and set it on the table between us. "But we'll get to that in a moment. First, I need to tell you something you probably already suspect. I sent the IRS evidence. I'm the one who mailed that package." "I know," I said. "I asked you to. You asked me to wait a week. I waited 3. But the point is, I did it, and I'd do it again. Samantha needed real consequences, not family lectures or second chances, or the endless forgiveness your parents keep offering her. She needed to face a system that doesn't care about her charm, or her tears, or her ability to make people believe her lies. The IRS is that system." I squeezed his hands. "Thank you. For believing me. For being the only one who ever did." which brings me to why I drove 900 miles at my age. He tapped the USB drive. There's a recording on here. Something I made 3 months ago when I realised Samantha was planning something worse than what she'd already done. I've been keeping that old tape recorder in my office for years, and I finally found a use for it that mattered. What's on it? I asked. A conversation between Samantha and your mother. I set up the recorder in my study when I knew they were coming over to discuss what to do about you disappearing. They didn't know I was recording, and they didn't know I was listening from the next room. He paused, his face showing pain I'd never seen before. Melissa, what's on that recording will break your heart. It broke mine, but you'll need it when this goes to court, when she tries to paint you as the villain and herself as the victim. This is the truth in their own words, with no filter and no performance. Tell me what they said. He shook his head. I can't. I won't. You need to hear it directly in context when you're ready. But I'm not giving this to you today. I'm giving it to you with the condition open it only after I'm gone. I don't mean when I leave Oregon. I mean when I'm actually gone. Dead. Because what's on here will change everything, and I don't want to be around to see what you do with it. Walter, you're scaring me. Good. You should be scared. What's on this recording is powerful enough to destroy Samantha completely, but it's also powerful enough to destroy you if you use it wrong. So I'm trusting you to use it wisely when the time is right, with the benefit of distance and grief and whatever wisdom you'll have gained by then. I took the USB drive, feeling its weight despite its size. Why are you talking like you're dying soon? Because I am, probably. The cancer I mentioned is progressing faster than the doctors expected. They're giving me 6 months, maybe a year, and I've decided I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure you're protected and Samantha faces consequences. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Make them face consequences, but don't lose yourself in revenge. I've watched you grow from a sweet little girl into a woman who's had to become hard just to survive. That hardness saved you, but it can also poison you if you're not careful. When this is all over, when Samantha pays for what she did and your family realizes what they lost, I need you to find a way to let it go. Not for them, for you. Teach them grace, not destruction. Show them what it looks like to be better than they were. I wanted to argue, to say that grace was for people who deserved it, that my family had forfeited any right to my mercy. But Walter's eyes were pleading with me, and I realised this was his dying wish, the one thing he wanted to know would happen after he was gone. I promise, I said, even though I wasn't sure I could keep it. I'll try. That's all I ask, to try. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting. I need to get back on the road. I have a hotel in Portland tonight, and I want to make it before dark. We walked out to his car together, and I hugged him one more time, breathing in his familiar smell of Old Spice and peppermint. I love you, Grandpa. Thank you for being the only one who saw me. I love you too, sweetheart, and for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Not because of what you're doing to them, but because of who you're becoming, despite them. He got into his old Buick, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot with a wave. I stood there watching him drive away, the USB drive clutched in my hand, feeling both grateful and terrified about what it contained. As Walter drove away that evening, Melissa noticed a black sedan pull out behind his car, following him toward the highway. The black sedan had followed Walter for 3 miles before turning off, according to the text he sent me when he reached his hotel in Portland. Private investigator, probably. But I lost him before he could see where I was staying. Don't worry about me. Worry about what comes next. That was the last message I received from him for 2 weeks, and the silence terrified me more than any threat Samantha could have made. 5 months after I'd left San Diego, the IRS made their move. I learned about it the same way the rest of the world did, through a news alert on my phone while I was kneading dough at the bakery. San Diego financial consultant under federal investigation for tax fraud. The article was short, clinical in its language, but devastating in its implications. The IRS had escalated from preliminary civil examination to formal criminal investigation, and they'd executed what's called a jeopardy assessment, a tool they only use when they believe someone is actively hiding assets or preparing to flee. Every bank account associated with Family First Consulting had been frozen without warning. Every business asset had been seized pending the investigation's outcome. Samantha had walked into her office that morning to find IRS agents boxing up her files, seizing her computers, and informing her that she was under federal investigation for tax evasion fraud and identity theft. The timing was surgical. She'd been scheduled to give a keynote speech at a financial planning conference that afternoon, one of those events where up-and-coming consultants network with potential high-value clients. Instead, she'd been photographed by local news cameras standing outside her office building, pale and shaking while federal agents carried boxes past her. The image had gone viral within hours. I sat in the bakery's back room, scrolling through news coverage on my phone, watching my sister's life unravel in real time. Part of me felt the satisfaction I'd been anticipating for months, the vindication of seeing someone who'd hurt me, finally face consequences. But another part, the part that had listened to Walter's advice about grace and not losing myself in revenge, felt something closer to sadness. Not for Samantha exactly, but for the waste of it all, for how different things could have been if she'd just been honest, if our parents had just seen me, if any of them had chosen truth over performance. The media coverage exploded over the next 48 hours. Rising financial consultants fall from grace. Family First Consulting accused of systematic fraud. Federal investigators probe San Diego business owners' tax returns. Every article included the same unflattering photo of Samantha outside her office, and every article mentioned the same details: millions in questionable deductions, fake invoices, shadow accounts, and the particularly damning detail that some of the fraudulent credit accounts had been opened using her sister's identity. That detail, the identity theft, seemed to capture the public's imagination in a way the tax fraud alone hadn't. It wasn't just financial crime anymore. It was family betrayal, sister stealing from sister, and people loved a good family drama. The comment sections filled with speculation and judgment. Some people defended Samantha, claiming she was innocent until proven guilty. But most expressed shock and disgust that someone would steal from their own family member. Her clients fled like rats from a sinking ship. I tracked it through the business registry and through social media, watching as one after another posted carefully worded statements about ending our professional relationship and seeking representation elsewhere. The corporate contracts, she'd been so proud of, the ones that had made her Family First Consulting profitable, all cancelled within a week. Her business partners, the two junior consultants who'd worked under her, issued a joint statement distancing themselves from her actions and announcing they were starting their own firm with a pointedly different name. The professional organisations she'd joined, the ones where she'd networked and built her reputation, quietly removed her from their membership directories. The Financial Planning Association, where she'd been slated to receive a Rising Star Award, cancelled her nomination. The country club, where she and Marcus belonged, asked them to resign their membership. Within 2 weeks, Samantha had gone from rising star to toxic pariah, and no one in San Diego's professional community wanted to be associated with her. But the cruelest blow came from Marcus, her husband of 3 years. I learned about it through a brief item in the legal notices section of the San Diego newspaper, the kind of thing most people never read, but I'd been checking obsessively. Marcus Gray files for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences. Walter, in one of his brief check-in calls before he went silent again, told me the real story. Marcus had told Samantha he was filing the morning after the federal agents raided her office. No discussion. No attempt to work through it. No standing by his wife during her darkest hour. Just a cold calculation that being married to someone under federal investigation would damage his law practice, his reputation, his carefully cultivated image as a respectable attorney. I can't be married to someone under federal investigation, he'd apparently told her, according to a mutual friend who'd witnessed the conversation. This affects my law practice. My partners are already asking questions. I need to protect my career. The irony wasn't lost on me. Samantha had spent years using people for her own advancement, stealing my ideas and my credit to build her success. And now the husband she'd married partially for his professional connections was discarding her using the same cold calculation she'd always employed. What goes around comes around, as the saying goes. Though I took no joy in seeing it play out this way. Her social media, which had once been a carefully curated display of success and happiness, went dark. The last post was the one about praying for her mentally unstable sister, and the comments had turned savage. Maybe you should worry about your own mental health. Identity theft is a crime, not a family dispute. Your sister was right to disappear from you. She'd disabled comments, then deleted the post entirely, then stopped posting altogether. I imagined her sitting in her parents' house, because where else would she go with her accounts frozen and her husband gone scrolling through the wreckage of her reputation, watching everything she'd built collapse. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant. This was justice, wasn't it? This was consequences for years of theft and betrayal. But I kept hearing Walter's voice. Don't lose yourself in revenge. Teach them grace, not destruction. 3 weeks after the IRS raid, Samantha received a package at my parents' house. I know because Walter told me about it in a brief, cryptic phone call where he sounded tired and somehow older than he'd seemed in Oregon. I sent her something, he said. Something to make her understand what she took from you wasn't just money. The package contained a single item, a family photo from 10 years ago. All of us at a 4th of July barbecue smiling at the camera. Everyone looked happy and I looked particularly young and hopeful, still believing I might matter to these people someday. But someone had taken a black marker and written across my face bold letters that couldn't be ignored. Now you notice. In her darkest moment, Samantha received a package, a family photo with everyone smiling, and written across Melissa's face. Now you notice. I didn't know what Walter was planning until it was too late to stop him. He'd gone quiet after sending the photo his brief phone calls, becoming even briefer, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite identify. When I asked if he was okay, he'd say he was fine, just tired, just dealing with the family situation. I should have recognised that tone. It was the sound of a man who'd made a final decision and was at peace with whatever consequences came next. 3 days after Samantha received the defaced photo, Walter called an emergency family meeting. He'd invited everyone to dinner at his house in Carlsbad, a Sunday evening gathering he framed as urgent family business. My mother and father came, of course. Samantha came driven by Marcus, who dropped her off and refused to come inside a small humiliation she had to endure in front of her parents. Even Aunt Helen came, though she told me later she'd almost declined, sensing that whatever Walter had planned would be ugly. I learned what happened that night through multiple sources piecing together the story like a prosecutor building a case. Aunt Helen called me the next day, shaken and worried. Walter's neighbour, Mrs. Patterson, had overheard parts of the conversation through open windows and shared details with her bridge club, which eventually made its way back to me through mutual connections. And Walter himself had recorded the dinner conversation on that old tape recorder he'd mentioned, the one he kept for documentation. That recording would eventually reach me, but not until after everything else had happened. The dinner started normally. Enough, Walter serving pot roast and potatoes, making small talk about the weather and neighbourhood gossip. But when dessert was cleared away and coffee was poured, he'd stood at the head of the table and made his announcement. I have a confession to make, he'd said, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. I was the one who sent the evidence to the IRS. Melissa gave me documentation of Samantha's fraud before she disappeared, and I mailed it to the federal investigators 3 weeks later, exactly as she'd asked me to. The silence that followed was apparently deafening. My mother had gone pale. My father had started to stand, then sat back down. And Samantha had looked at Walter with an expression that Aunt Helen described as pure hatred mixed with calculation. You destroyed my life, Samantha had said quietly. You're my grandfather. You were supposed to protect me." "I am protecting the family," Walter had replied, "by making sure there are consequences for actions that harm us. You committed federal fraud using your sister's identity. You stole from Melissa for years, used her credit, destroyed her financial standing, and never once felt remorse. The IRS needed to know, and now they do." My father had tried to mediate, saying something about families sticking together, about not airing dirty laundry to government agencies. But Walter had cut him off. "You've enabled this behaviour for 30 years. He'd said, his voice harder than anyone had heard it before. "Every time Samantha did something wrong, you excused it. Every time Melissa achieved something, you ignored it. You created this situation by teaching one daughter she could do anything without consequences, and teaching the other that she didn't matter. I'm done being silent about it." Then he turned to my mother, and Aunt Helen said his expression had been almost sad. "Linda, you've been silent for 30 years. You watched Melissa be dismissed and diminished, and you said nothing. You participated in it. You favoured Samantha so completely that you made Melissa invisible in her own family. And when she finally left, when she finally chose herself over people who never chose her, you didn't even notice she was gone for 2 weeks. Enough. It's enough." My mother had started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse, Aunt Helen told me. They were tears of anger and embarrassment at being called out. She'd left shortly after my father, trailing behind her, both of them refusing to acknowledge what Walter had said. Samantha had stayed. She'd helped Walter clean up the dinner dishes, making small talk that seemed almost normal, as if the confrontation hadn't happened. But when Aunt Helen was putting on her coat to leave, she'd seen Samantha corner Walter in the kitchen, speaking too quietly for Helen to hear the words, but with body language that made Helen uncomfortable enough to linger by the door. Later, much later, Walter's neighbour, Mrs. Patterson, would tell the police what she'd overheard through the kitchen window that faced her yard. Samantha's voice sweet and concerned. "Grandpa, all this stress can't be good for your heart. Men your age need to be careful. Maybe you should rest. Stop worrying about things that don't concern you. Sometimes it's better to forget certain things for everyone's health." Walter's response had been firm. "Are you threatening me, Samantha?" "Of course not," she'd said, and Mrs. Patterson described her laugh as chilling. "I'm worried about you, that's all. Family worries about family." On Tuesday, Samantha had visited Walter at his home. She'd called, first Aunt Helen learned from checking Walter's phone records later, saying she wanted to apologise to make peace, to understand his perspective. Walter, being Walter, had believed in second chances and reconciliation. He'd let her in. Mrs. Patterson had seen Samantha arrive at 10 in the morning carrying a bag from the local bakery. She'd seen them sitting on the porch together, drinking coffee, appearing to have a civil conversation. Samantha had stayed for an hour, leaving with a hug that looked genuine enough from a distance. Mrs. Patterson had remarked to her husband that it was nice to see the family working things out. But something about that visit bothered Mrs. Patterson in retrospect, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. Maybe it was the way Samantha had insisted on making the coffee herself, shooing Walter away from the kitchen. Maybe it was how Samantha had asked about Walter's medication, what he took and when, with what seemed like excessive interest in the details. Maybe it was just the timing, the way Samantha had suddenly wanted reconciliation right after Walter had publicly destroyed her defence. Wednesday morning, Walter had called Aunt Helen, his voice cheerful, saying he felt good about the conversation with Samantha, that maybe there was hope for healing after all. He'd mentioned feeling a bit tired, but attributed it to the stress of the week. Helen had told him to rest, to take care of himself, and he'd promised he would. Wednesday afternoon, Walter had driven to his doctor's appointment, a routine checkup he'd had scheduled for weeks. He had never made it there. Wednesday evening, Walter's car was found at a red light engine, running him slumped over the wheel. Heart stopped. The call came at 6:30 on Wednesday evening, my father's number flashing on my prepaid phone. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken since I'd left, and I'd assumed any contact from him would be about the lawsuit or demands that I come home and apologise. But something made me pick up some instinct that this was different. Melissa. His voice was shaking. It's Walter. He had a heart attack. He's at Scripps Memorial in La Jolla. They don't think he's going to make it. If you want to say goodbye, you need to come now. I was in my car within 5 minutes, throwing clothes into a bag, leaving a note for Rose that said only family emergency will call soon. The drive from Bayshore to San Diego took 11 hours, and I drove it in a blur of tears and terror, breaking every speed limit, stopping only for gas and coffee that I could barely swallow. I called the hospital 3 times during the drive, and each time they told me Walter was still alive, still hanging on, but his condition was critical. I arrived at Scripps Memorial at 5:30 Thursday morning, exhausted and terrified, still wearing my bakery apron because I'd forgotten to take it off. My parents were in the ICU waiting room along with Aunt Helen and a few of Walter's elderly friends from his church. Samantha wasn't there, which should have been my first clue that something was wrong. My mother looked up when I walked in, her eyes red from crying, and for a moment I thought I saw actual relief on her face. Melissa, thank God. He's been asking for you. They let me into his room alone. Walter was hooked up to machines that beeped and hissed, his face pale against the white pillow, looking smaller and frailer than I'd ever seen him. But his eyes were open, and when he saw me, he smiled. There's my girl, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I knew you'd come. I took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV line, and started crying. Grandpa, what happened? You said you felt good. You said you were fine. I was. He coughed, a rattling sound that made the machines beep faster. Until I wasn't. Melissa, listen, not much time. You have to teach them grace. Remember that. Don't let this make you bitter. Teach them grace. I will. I promised, though I didn't understand why those were the words he chose, why grace mattered more than justice or truth or all the other things he could have said with his last breath. He squeezed my hand with surprising strength. The recording. Check your mail. I sent it Tuesday. Everything you need to know. Everything they don't want you to know. His eyes started to close, then opened again with effort. Love you, sweetheart. Proud of you. So proud. I love you too. I said, but I don't think he heard me. The machine started screaming, nurses rushed in, and I was pushed out of the room. 20 minutes later, a doctor came out and told us Walter was gone. The coroner ruled it natural causes within hours. Myocardial infarction, the medical term for heart attack. Walter had been 78 years old, with a history of heart disease and high blood pressure. His death, while sudden, was not particularly surprising from a medical standpoint. The doctor who signed the death certificate had been sympathetic, but clear, elderly men with Walter's health history die of heart attacks every day. There was nothing unusual about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The timing was too convenient, coming just 3 days after Walter had publicly admitted to sending the IRS evidence, just 2 days after Samantha had visited him at home. I pulled the attending physician aside and asked about toxicology screening. He'd looked uncomfortable. There's no evidence of foul play, Ms. Gray. Your grandfather had documented heart disease. Without specific reason to suspect poisoning, we don't automatically run tox screens on elderly patients who die of apparent natural causes. I'm requesting one anyway, I'd said. How much does it cost? For a comprehensive screen, about $2,000, and it would need to be paid up front, since insurance won't cover it without medical necessity. He'd paused. But honestly, even if you pay for it by the time you get results, your grandfather will have been buried or cremated. If you're concerned about foul play, you should talk to the police. I had talked to the police. They'd been polite but dismissive. An 88-year-old man with heart disease dying of a heart attack wasn't suspicious. Without evidence of a crime, they couldn't justify an investigation. Did I have any proof that someone had harmed him? Any witnesses? Any concrete reason to believe this wasn't natural causes? I told them about Samantha's visit, about the veiled threat Mrs. Patterson had overheard, about the convenient timing. The detective had written it all down, but his expression had been skeptical. Family tensions run high when someone's under investigation, he'd said. But that doesn't mean there's been a crime. I'm sorry for your loss, but unless you can provide actual evidence, there's nothing we can pursue. By the time I'd scraped together the $2,000 for the toxicology screen, selling my car, and borrowing from my dwindling savings, Walter had already been cremated. Samantha had suggested it to my parents at the funeral home, saying it's what Walter would have wanted, that it was simpler and more affordable. My mother, grief-stricken and exhausted, had agreed. The cremation had been completed within 72 hours of his death, eliminating any possibility of further testing. I attended the funeral 3 days later, sitting in the back of the chapel while my family occupied the front rows. Samantha was there, dressed in black, crying genuine-looking tears, accepting condolences from people who didn't know she might have killed him. I watched her hug my mother, watched her place a rose on Walter's urn, and I felt rage so intense I had to leave before I did something I'd regret. The package arrived at Rose's bakery a week after the funeral, forwarded from my Oregon address. It was a padded envelope with Walter's shaky handwriting on the label postmarked the Tuesday before he died. Inside was the USB drive he'd given me in Oregon, the one he told me to open only after he was gone, along with a note written in his careful script. Melissa, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. I mailed this Tuesday morning before Samantha's visit because I had a feeling she might try something. I'm not paranoid, just old and observant. The recording on this drive will break your heart, but you need to hear it. It's the truth. They don't want you to know the real reason they've treated you the way they have. Use it wisely. Use it with grace. But use it. Love, always, Grandpa Walter. I sat in my room above the bakery holding the USB drive, feeling the weight of it in my palm. Whatever was on this recording, Walter had thought it important enough to mail it the day before he died to make sure I'd get it, even if something happened to him. He'd known Samantha was dangerous. He'd known and he'd done it anyway, and now he was gone. With trembling hands, Melissa opened the USB. Inside was a single audio file dated 3 years earlier titled The Conspiracy MP3. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop, my hands shaking so badly I could barely connect it. The file loaded, showing a runtime of 14 minutes and 32 seconds. I clicked play, and Walter's old tape recorder delivered its secret with painful clarity. The ambient kitchen sounds unmistakable, dishes, clattering water running, the distinctive hum of my parents' refrigerator I'd heard my entire life. The date stamp on the file read 3 years earlier, which meant I would have been 30, still living in Los Angeles, still making my monthly trips to San Diego for family obligations, still believing that if I just tried hard enough, they might finally see me. The recording started mid-conversation, Samantha's voice clear and animated in a way I recognised as her planning mode when she was working through a problem that needed solving. I'm just saying, Mum, we need to be strategic about this. Melissa's been talking about that financial consulting idea for months. If she actually follows through with it, people are going to notice her. And if people notice her, they're going to realise she's actually smart. Smarter than me, if we're being honest. There was a pause, the sound of coffee being poured. My mother's voice came next, casual in a way that made my stomach turn. You've always been the one people gravitate to, sweetheart. Melissa has never had your charisma. Charisma doesn't matter if she's more capable, Samantha said, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. She's a CPA mum. She's methodical and detail-oriented, and she actually knows what she's talking about. If she starts a consulting business, she'll probably be good at it. Better than me. And then, everyone starts comparing us, and I don't come out looking better in that comparison. So, what are you suggesting? My mother's tone was interested, engaged in a way I'd never heard directed at anything concerning me. I'm suggesting we make sure she doesn't have the time or energy to build something, keep her busy with family obligations. You know how she is. She can't say no when we need her. If every time she tries to work on her business plan, we need her to help with something, she'll put herself last. She always does. The sound of a chair scraping, my mother moving closer. That's not going to work forever, Samantha. Eventually, she'll figure out what we're doing. Then we take it? Samantha's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing which restaurant to choose for dinner. If she creates something good, I take credit for it. Seriously, Mum, think about it. She's too kind to fight back, too conditioned to accept being overlooked. If I say, I came up with an idea, who are people going to believe the charismatic one, everyone already pays attention to, or the quiet one no one remembers is in the room? I paused the recording, my hand over my mouth fighting nausea. This wasn't casual favoritism or unconscious neglect. This was calculated, deliberate suppression. They'd had a strategy. They'd discussed it like a business plan, weighing options, considering outcomes, deciding how best to keep me small so Samantha could shine. I forced myself to press play again. My mother was speaking now, her voice thoughtful. You really think she won't fight back? I know, she won't. Samantha laughed, and the sound of it made me want to scream. She's been accepting being second best her entire life. Why would she start standing up for herself now? And even if she did try to say something, who would believe her? You and Dad have spent 30 years establishing that she's the quiet, forgettable one, and I'm the successful, charming one. That's the family narrative. No one's going to suddenly decide she's been the victim and I've been stealing from her. There was a long pause, just the sound of coffee cups being set down, water still running in the sink. Then my mother spoke again, and her words broke something fundamental inside me. You're right. She won't fight back. She never has. Remember when she won that accounting award in college and we didn't go to the ceremony? She cried for a week, but she never said we should have been there. She just accepted it. That's who she is. Exactly. Samantha's voice was confident now the plan solidified. So here's what we do. I take her business idea. I launch it myself, and when she inevitably confronts me about it, I act confused. I say we must have been thinking along the same lines. You and Dad back me up, say it's a misunderstanding, and she'll drop it, because that's what she does. She drops things. She accepts things. She disappears into the background where she's comfortable. And if she doesn't drop it, she will. Samantha sounded absolutely certain. Because the alternative is admitting that her own family has been using her, and she's not strong enough to face that. She'll convince herself it was an honest mistake, or that maybe I did think of it independently, or that it doesn't matter because family is more important than business. She'll make excuses for us because that's easier than accepting the truth. My mother's voice was quiet when she spoke next. Sometimes I feel guilty about how we've treated her. She deserves better. Mom, don't. Samantha's tone shifted, becoming almost gentle. Melissa is fine. She has a job, an apartment, a life. She's not suffering. She's just not the center of attention. And honestly, she doesn't handle attention well anyway. We're doing her a favor by letting her stay in the background where she's comfortable. This way she doesn't have the pressure of expectations or success. She can just exist, and that's enough for someone like her. Someone like her. The phrase echoed in my mind, and I realized that's how they'd always seen me. Not as a person with potential or dreams or worth, but as someone whose role was to stay small so they could be big. And they'd convinced themselves this was kindness, that keeping me suppressed was somehow protecting me from the burden of being noticed. The recording continued for a few more minutes, discussing logistics of how to distract me, which family obligations to emphasize, how to make sure I stayed busy enough that building my own business would be impossible. They talked about me like I was a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be handled, a threat to be neutralized. And they did it all while drinking coffee in the kitchen of the house I'd grown up, in the house where I'd spent 30 years trying to earn their love. When the recording ended, I sat in silence staring at my laptop screen. Walter had been right. This had broken my heart. But it had also clarified everything, removed any remaining doubt about whether I'd misunderstood or overreacted. This was proof, in their own words, that my family's treatment of me had been intentional, strategic, and sustained over years. I had the weapon to destroy them all. This recording, combined with the IRS evidence and the fraud documentation, would demolish any remaining credibility Samantha had. It would show my mother as a co-conspirator in emotional abuse. It would prove that everything they'd done to me was calculated malice, not innocent oversight. I could release it to the media, play it in court, use it to ensure they never recovered from the damage they'd inflicted on themselves. But Walter's dying words echoed in my mind, soft and insistent, the last thing he'd said to me before the machine started screaming, "Teach them grace, not revenge." Melissa had the weapon to destroy them all. But Walter's dying words echoed, "Teach them grace, not revenge." What would she choose? My first instinct was to send the recording everywhere immediately. Post it on social media, email it to the local news stations, attach it to court filings for Samantha's IRS case, make sure every single person who'd ever doubted me heard exactly what my family had said about me when they thought no one was listening. I had my phone in my hand, the file ready to upload to my finger, hovering over the send button that would detonate everything. But I stopped. Not because I wasn't angry enough, but because I was too angry. My hands were shaking, my vision blurred with tears, my breath coming in short gasps that felt like panic. This wasn't strategic thinking. This was rage, pure and justified, but also dangerous. If I acted from this place, from this white-hot fury that wanted to see them burn, I'd regret it later. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually, just like Walter had warned. I set the phone down and forced myself to breathe, to count to 10, to 20, to 100. I walked to the window and stared out at the ocean, watching waves crash against the rocks below, methodical and relentless and patient. The ocean didn't rush. It just kept coming, wearing down stone through consistency rather than explosive force. Maybe that's what Walter had meant about grace. Not forgiveness, not excusing what they'd done, but choosing to respond with strategy rather than reaction. I called Ethan. It was late past 11, but he answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting for my call. "Melissa, what's wrong?" "I need to talk to someone who won't tell me what to do," I said. "Someone who'll just listen and maybe help me think clearly. Can you come over?" He was at my door 15 minutes later, still wearing his pajama pants, under a hastily thrown-on jacket, his hair standing up in ways that would have been funny if I hadn't been barely holding myself together. I played him the recording without explanation, watching his face change from confused to horrified to furious as Samantha and my mother discussed me like a problem to be solved. When it ended, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "You have every right to destroy them. You know that, right? After everything they've done after Walter's death, which we both know wasn't natural, after 33 years of being treated like you don't matter, you have every right to burn it all down." "I know," I said quietly. "That's why I'm hesitating, because I want to destroy them. I want them to suffer the way I suffered, to feel invisible and dismissed and like they don't matter. I want everyone to know what they did, to see them for what they are. But if I do that, if I act from that place of wanting revenge, then I become them. I become someone who hurts people deliberately, strategically, with calculation. And I don't want to be that person." "You're nothing like them," Ethan said firmly. "They hurt you for no reason except their own insecurity and cruelty. You'd be responding to actual harm with justified consequences. That's not the same thing." "Isn't it, though?" I looked at him, trying to articulate something I was only beginning to understand myself. Walter's last words to me were, "Teach them grace." He died trying to make them face consequences, while also trying to make sure I didn't lose myself in revenge. And I think what he meant was that I have a choice about who I become in response to this. I can be the person who destroys them completely, or I can be the person who gives them a chance to do the right thing before consequences become inevitable. "They don't deserve a chance," Ethan said, but his tone was gentler now, less challenging. "Probably not," I agreed, "but maybe I deserve to be the kind of person who offers one anyway. Not for them, for me. So that when this is all over, I can look in the mirror and know I tried grace first, even if they rejected it. We talked for another hour, Ethan playing devil's advocate, while I worked through my thoughts out loud. Eventually, he left with a hug and a promise to be available whenever I needed him, no questions asked. I sat alone in my room, the USB drive still plugged into my laptop, the audio file paused on the screen like a frozen accusation. I couldn't sleep, so I walked down to the beach. It was after midnight, the sand cold under my bare feet, the sound of waves filling the darkness. I sat on a piece of driftwood and pulled out my journal, the one I'd been keeping since I arrived in Oregon, and I started writing a letter. Not to my family, not to anyone else, but to my future self, the person I'd be when all this was over. I was silent from fear for 33 years. I wrote the words barely visible in the moonlight. Silent because I thought if I stayed quiet and small and undemanding, they might finally love me. Silent because speaking up meant risking the little scraps of attention they occasionally threw my way. Silent because I didn't believe I deserved to be heard. But now, I'm silent by choice. I have the power to speak, to shout, to make sure everyone knows what they did. And I'm choosing to wait, to think, to act with intention rather than reaction. This time, silence is my weapon. Not the silence of fear or submission, but the silence of someone who knows exactly what she's holding and is deciding when and how to use it. They taught me to be invisible. Now I'll teach them that invisible doesn't mean powerless. I sat there until dawn started to lighten the eastern sky, thinking about Walter and his tape recorder, about how he'd spent years documenting truth, because he knew that eventually truth would matter. He'd given me the tools I needed, not just to prove what happened, but to prove it was intentional. That recording was devastating because it wasn't open to interpretation. It was them, in their own words, planning my suppression like a military campaign. But releasing it publicly right now would be an explosion. Satisfying, yes. Justified, absolutely. But also final. Once that recording was public, there was no going back, no room for anything except warfare. And before I committed to that path, I needed to know if there was any possibility, however small, that Samantha was capable of conscience. That she could hear the evidence of her own cruelty and feel remorse, that she could choose confession over continued lies. I didn't expect her to confess. After everything she'd done, after possibly killing Walter, after forging evidence and filing fraudulent lawsuits, why would she suddenly develop honesty now? But I needed to give her the opportunity, not because she deserved it, but because I needed to know I'd tried. That when I eventually destroyed her, and I would destroy her if she didn't choose differently, I'd done it after offering an alternative. Back in my room, I pulled out my prepaid phone and typed out a message to Samantha's number, which I'd kept stored in my contacts, even after I'd left. My thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment before I finally pressed it. Melissa sent one text to Samantha. We need to talk. Alone. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Cafe Solstice. Come alone, or the recording goes public. I arrived at Cafe Solstice 20 minutes early, choosing a table in the back corner where we could talk privately, but still be surrounded by enough people that Samantha couldn't make a scene without witnesses. The cafe was one of those trendy San Diego spots with exposed brick and overpriced lattes, the kind of place where young professionals met for business lunches and no one paid attention to anyone else's conversations. Perfect for what I needed. I ordered a coffee I had no intention of drinking and watched the door. At exactly 2 o'clock, Samantha walked in. She looked terrible in a way that would have satisfied me a month ago, but now just made me tired. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore no makeup, and the circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose in a way that spoke of stress rather than intentional dieting. The federal investigation had clearly taken its toll. She spotted me and walked over slowly like she was approaching a dangerous animal. When she sat down across from me, she didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or defiance. Possibly both. "You look good," she said finally, and there was something bitter in her tone. "Oregon must agree with you." "How did you know I was in Oregon?" I asked, though I already knew. The private investigator probably, or the civil suit paperwork that had been forwarded to my address. "I've known where you were for months," she said. "I just didn't do anything about it because honestly, I was relieved you were gone. One less problem to deal with while my entire life fell apart." She gestured at herself. "Thanks for that, by the way. The IRS investigation has been delightful." "You committed federal fraud using my identity," I said evenly. "The IRS investigation is a consequence of your choices, not mine." "Walter told you to send that evidence, didn't he?" Her voice cracked slightly on his name. "Before he died, he gave you all the documentation and told you exactly how to destroy me." "Walter gave me the truth," I replied. "What I chose to do with it was my decision." I pulled out my phone, opened the audio file, and set it on the table between us. "But he gave me something else too, something you need to hear." I pressed play. The recording started with Samantha's voice clear and unmistakable. "I can't let her shine. She's smarter, more capable. People might actually notice her if I don't keep her suppressed." Samantha's face drained of colour so quickly, I thought she might faint. Her hand shot out, grabbing my phone, stopping the playback. "Where did you get that? How did you... Walter?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I nodded silently, watching her process what this meant. That recording was 3 years old, which meant Walter had been documenting their conspiracy long before I'd even known it existed. He'd been protecting me in ways I'd never realised, gathering evidence for a fight I hadn't known I'd need to wage. "There's 14 minutes of it," I said quietly. "You and Mum in the kitchen planning how to keep me busy with family obligations so I wouldn't have time to build a career. Discussing how you'd take credit for my ideas because I was too kind to fight back. Talking about me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person who deserved respect. It's all there in your own words, with no room for interpretation or excuses." Samantha's hands were shaking as she set my phone down. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at the table, her breath coming in short gasps. Then, to my surprise, she started crying. Not the pretty, manipulative tears I'd seen her use countless times to get sympathy. These were ugly, desperate sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken. "I was terrified of you," she said through her tears. "My entire life I was terrified you'd figure out that you were better than me. Smarter, more capable, more naturally talented at everything that mattered. Mum and Dad made it easy to overlook you, but I always knew the truth. If people actually paid attention to you, if they actually saw you clearly, they'd realise I was the mediocre one. So, I made sure they didn't see you. I made sure you stayed in the background where I could pretend you weren't a threat. I was never trying to compete with you," I said, and I was surprised by how sad I felt rather than angry. "I just wanted to exist, to have my own life, my own achievements, my own identity that wasn't defined by being your less interesting sister. You could have let me have that without it taking anything away from you." "I know." She wiped her face with her sleeve. "I know that now. But I couldn't see it then. All I could see was that if you succeeded, it meant I wasn't special anymore. And being special was the only thing I had. You were always the smart one, the responsible one, the one who actually worked hard. I was just the pretty one, the charming one, the one people liked. And I was terrified that wouldn't be enough if you were standing next to me actually being impressive." We sat in silence for a moment, the cafe noise washing over us. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated by her confession, but mostly I just felt exhausted. 33 years of pain because my sister couldn't handle the possibility that we could both be worth noticing. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning underneath. "You have 7 days, 1 week from today. You're going to confess everything to the family. Not just the conspiracy to keep me suppressed, but the fraud, the identity theft, the fake invoices, all of it. You're going to tell them that you opened credit accounts in my name, that you committed tax fraud, and that you tried to frame me as the mastermind when the IRS started investigating. They'll hate me, she whispered. They should hate you. You committed crimes against your own sister for years. I leaned forward. You're also going to confess to the IRS. Work with your lawyer to make a deal, but you're going to admit to everything. Full confession, no more lies, no more trying to blame me or claim I was directing you. The truth complete and documented. And if I do all that? She asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Then I keep the recording private. It stays between us, evidence of why you did what you did, but not public ammunition. You'll face legal consequences for the fraud, but your reputation might survive if you handle this with honesty instead of continued deception. I paused. But if you don't confess, if you try to hide or lie or manipulate your way out of this one more time, I release everything publicly. The recording goes to every news station, gets posted online, becomes attached to every court filing. Everyone will know not just what you did, but why you did it. That you weren't a desperate woman making mistakes, but a calculating person who deliberately destroyed her sister out of insecurity. 7 days, she repeated numbly. 7 days, starting now. She stood up slowly like she'd aged decades in the past 15 minutes. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes that held something I couldn't quite identify. I'm sorry. For whatever it's worth, I'm genuinely sorry. I know it's too late, and I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I understand now what I took from you. And I'm sorry. I believe you, I said. And I did. I believed she was sorry. I just wasn't sure if she was sorry for what she'd done or sorry she'd been caught. Samantha agreed through tears. But as she left, Melissa saw something in her sister's eyes, calculation, not surrender. I waited for Samantha to confess, but I prepared for her to betray me. The calculation I'd seen in her eyes had been unmistakable, and 33 years of experience with my sister had taught me that when cornered, she didn't surrender. She strategized. The first 3 days were silent. No phone calls, no texts, no public statements. I monitored her social media obsessively, checking every few hours for signs of what she was planning. Nothing. Her Facebook and Instagram remained dormant, the last post still that deleted prayer for my mental health from months ago. I should have found the silence reassuring evidence that maybe she was actually preparing to confess. Instead, it made me nervous. Samantha was never quiet unless she was planning something. Aunt Helen, who I'd been calling daily for updates, confirmed my suspicions on day 3. She's been meeting with someone, Helen told me. Expensive-looking woman in a business suit came to your parents' house twice this week. I asked your mother who it was, and she got defensive, said it was none of my business. But I saw the woman's car. It had a bumper sticker for some crisis management firm in Los Angeles. A PR firm. Of course, Samantha wasn't preparing to confess. She was preparing to spin. On day 4, she made her move. A lengthy Facebook post appeared at 8 in the morning, carefully crafted and devastating in its strategic manipulation. My truth about growing up in an abusive home. The title read, and what followed was a masterclass in playing the victim. She talked about growing up in a household where love was conditional, where she was pitted against her sister in constant competition, where she was expected to be perfect, while her sibling was allowed to be human. She described our mother as controlling and manipulative, our father as emotionally distant. She painted herself as someone who'd spent her entire life trying to meet impossible standards, who'd made mistakes because she'd never learned healthy coping mechanisms, who was now facing consequences for behaviours that were really symptoms of childhood trauma. The post mentioned me only obliquely as my sister who disappeared and is now making accusations I'm trying to understand. She didn't deny the fraud directly. instead framing it as financial decisions I made under extreme stress that I'm working to resolve through proper legal channels. She apologised for any pain I may have caused, while simultaneously suggesting that pain was mutual, that we were both victims of the same dysfunctional family system. The post got thousands of reactions within hours. Supportive comments poured in from people praising her bravery, sharing their own stories of family dysfunction, offering sympathy and understanding. She was reframing the narrative before I could control it, making herself the sympathetic figure, the damaged child who'd grown into a flawed adult through no fault of her own. I stared at my laptop screen, rage and admiration warring inside me. It was brilliant, really. She'd taken everything that was true about our family, the dysfunction and favoritism and emotional neglect, and weaponized it in her own defense. She had made herself the victim of the same system that had actually victimized me, erasing my experience while co-opting the language of abuse survival. On day 5, I counted. I created an anonymous blog on Medium, titled it The Invisible Daughter: What Happens When Your Family Forgets You Exist, and published excerpts of the recording. Not the full 14 minutes and not with names attached, just carefully selected clips that showed the calculated nature of the conspiracy, the deliberate planning, the cold discussion of how to keep the smart sister suppressed so the charming sister could shine. I framed it as a story about sibling rivalry taken to criminal extremes, about parents who enabled abuse through their silence, about the difference between family dysfunction and deliberate malice. I let the recording speak for itself. The voice is clear, but the context anonymous enough that casual readers wouldn't immediately connect it to Samantha's post. But anyone who knew us would recognise the voices. Anyone paying attention would see that these weren't two sisters damaged by the same system. This was one sister systematically destroying the other, while their mother helped plan the destruction. The blog post went viral faster than Samantha's Facebook post had. It was picked up by psychology forums shared in abuse survivor groups, discussed on Reddit threads about toxic families. People weren't just sympathetic, they were horrified. The comment section filled with outrage at the calculated cruelty, at the mother's complicity, at the casual way they discussed suppressing someone's potential. By day 6, mainstream media outlets were trying to identify who the blog post was about. Amateur internet detectives were comparing the voices in the recording to public figures looking for matches. A few had already connected it to Samantha's IRS troubles, noting the timing was suspicious. The story was gaining momentum, and Samantha's PR-crafted victimhood narrative was starting to crack. On the morning of day 7, I sent a text to everyone in the extended family. My parents, Aunt Helen cousins, I hadn't spoken to in years, even distant relatives who'd attended that fateful July barbecue. Family meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Mum and Dad's house. Attendance is not optional. The truth will be revealed. I arrived at 6:30, letting myself in with the key I'd never returned. My mother was in the kitchen, my father in the living room looking uncomfortable. By 7:15, relatives had gathered, filling the living room with awkward small talk and confused glances. Samantha arrived last, her face pale. Marcus conspicuously absent. I stood at the front of the room and plugged my laptop into the television, the same TV where we'd watched family movies during holidays, back when I'd still believed I was part of this family. Thank you all for coming, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I asked you here because 7 days ago, I gave Samantha a chance to tell you the truth herself. She chose to lie publicly instead, so now you'll hear the truth in her own words. I pressed play. For 14 minutes and 32 seconds, the room listened to Samantha and my mother discuss me like a problem to be managed, a threat to be neutralised, a person whose potential needed to be systematically destroyed, so Samantha could shine. I watched their faces as they heard it, the shock and horror and dawning understanding that this wasn't sibling rivalry or family dysfunction. This was calculated cruelty, planned and executed over years. When it ended, the silence was absolute. My mother was crying, but no one moved to comfort her. My father stared at the floor. Samantha sat frozen, unable to meet anyone's eyes. As the recording ended in shocked silence, Melissa said calmly, "Tomorrow morning, this story goes to the Washington Post." I kept my promise. The next morning at 9 a.m, I published an updated version of The Invisible Daughter with real names, real context, and the full recording embedded in the post. I sent it simultaneously to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and every major news outlet I could find contact information for. By noon, 3 journalists had already called requesting interviews. By evening, the story had been picked up by national news. The blog post went viral in ways I hadn't anticipated. 10 million views in the first 48 hours. The comments section became a confessional, thousands of people sharing their own stories of being the forgotten child, the overlooked sibling, the family member whose achievements were dismissed while someone else's mediocrity was celebrated. "This is my story," one woman wrote. "I have a PhD in biochemistry, but my parents still only talk about my brother who sells insurance. I've spent 40 years trying to understand why I wasn't enough." "I'm the invisible daughter in my family too," another commented. "My sister got a new car for graduation. I got a card. When I brought it up years later, my mother said she didn't remember it that way." The comments went on for pages, hundreds and then thousands of them, each one a variation on the same painful theme. People who'd been made to feel like they didn't matter, who'd spent their lives trying to earn recognition from families who would never give it, who'd finally found validation in seeing their experience reflected in someone else's story. Major outlets wanted interviews, but I was selective. I chose a journalist from NPR named Sarah Chen, who'd written thoughtfully about family dysfunction and generational trauma. We did the interview over the phone, her questions careful and respectful, giving me space to tell the story in my own words. "What would you say to people who think this is just revenge?" she asked toward the end of our conversation. "That you're publicly destroying your family out of anger?" I'd thought about this question for days, knowing it would come. "I think we misunderstand what revenge really is," I said slowly. "People think revenge is destruction, tearing down the people who hurt you, making them suffer the way you suffered. But that's not revenge. That's just perpetuating the cycle. Real revenge is becoming someone they can't ignore. It's taking everything they try to suppress about you and making it so visible, so undeniable that they have to acknowledge you existed all along. My family tried to make me invisible. Now my story is being read by millions of people. That's not destruction. That's proof that their efforts failed." The interview aired 2 days later and was shared across social media platforms, quoted in articles, discussed on talk shows. People responded to the idea that revenge could be about reclamation rather than retaliation, that the best response to being diminished was to become undeniable. My inbox filled with messages from strangers. Some were supportive, others critical, accusing me of airing private family matters publicly or being vindictive. But the ones that moved me most were from people who said the story had changed something for them, had given them permission to stop seeking validation from people who would never offer it. One email in particular made me cry. It was from a woman named Patricia, 62 years old, who wrote, "I've wanted to take art classes since I was 22. I was good at drawing, loved it more than anything. But my family always needed something. My mother needed help with my younger siblings. Then my husband needed support building his business. Then my kids needed me. I told myself I'd take those classes someday when everyone else's needs were met. I'm 62 now, and I just realized someday never comes unless you make it come. Your story gave me courage to finally enroll in the classes I delayed for 40 years. I start next week. Thank you for showing me that it's not selfish to choose yourself." I read that email 3 times, then saved it in a folder I titled, "Why This Mattered." Because that was the point, wasn't it? Not to destroy Samantha or my parents, though they were facing consequences they'd earned. The point was to show other invisible daughters that they didn't have to stay invisible, that choosing themselves wasn't selfish or wrong, that they deserved to exist as full people, rather than supporting characters in someone else's story. The story continued to spread. Psychology. Today published an article analysing the recording as a case study in family scapegoating. Support groups formed online for people who identified as invisible children. A literary agent contacted me about writing a book. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow my story. It was overwhelming and exhausting and more attention than I'd ever wanted. But it was also undeniable. I was no longer someone who could be overlooked or dismissed. Whether my family acknowledged it or not, I existed. Loudly, visibly, impossibly to ignore. Samantha had gone silent after the family meeting. Her social media accounts deleted, her phone disconnected. The IRS investigation continued without her cooperation, which meant it was escalating to criminal charges. My parents hadn't contacted me, and I hadn't expected them to. Aunt Helen called daily with updates telling me that the extended family had essentially shunned my parents and Samantha, that people were calling them out publicly for their treatments of me, that the consequences were severe and ongoing. I felt satisfied in a distant way, like watching a storm from inside a warm house. They were facing consequences, yes, but I was building something new, something that had nothing to do with them. I was becoming the person I might have been all along if they hadn't spent 33 years trying to keep me small. The blog post hit 15 million views. News outlets in other countries picked up the story. I was invited to speak at conferences about family dynamics, emotional abuse, the psychology of scapegoating. My life had transformed completely, all because I'd finally stopped being silent and started being honest. Just as Melissa's story became a national conversation, her mother called with a confession that explained everything. I almost didn't answer when my mother's name appeared on my phone screen. We hadn't spoken directly since Walter's funeral, and before that, not since the night I'd left. Whatever she had to say after weeks of silence after the recording had exposed her role in the conspiracy after the whole world had heard her discuss suppressing her own daughter like it was a strategic business decision. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. But curiosity won out over anger. I answered on the fourth ring. "What do you want, Mum?" Her voice was small, tentative in a way I'd never heard from her before. "I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago. Can we meet? Please, just you and me somewhere private." Every instinct told me this was a trap, another manipulation, another attempt to control the narrative now that public opinion had turned against her so completely. But there was something in her voice, a brokenness that sounded genuine, that made me agree against my better judgment. We met at a coffee shop in Del Mar neutral territory, halfway between San Diego and where I was staying. She looked like she'd aged a decade in the past few weeks. Her hair, usually perfectly coloured and styled, showed grey roots. She wore no makeup, and the lines around her eyes and mouth seemed deeper, carved by stress and sleepless nights. "Thank you for coming," she said when I sat down across from her. "I know you have every reason not to." "I'm here," I said, my tone deliberately neutral, "but I'm not promising anything beyond listening. You have 20 minutes. She nodded, wrapping her hands around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. "I need to tell you about something Samantha did, something I've been too ashamed and too terrified to admit to anyone, including your father." She took a shaky breath. "Samantha has been stealing from me for 5 years, embezzling from my personal accounts. $80,000 total, maybe more. I'm still finding transactions I didn't authorize." I stared at her, trying to process this new information. "You're telling me Samantha stole from you while you were helping her steal from me?" "I discovered it 2 years ago," she continued, not meeting my eyes. "I was reviewing bank statements and found withdrawals. I hadn't made transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. When I confronted Samantha about it, she admitted it immediately. Didn't even try to deny it. She just looked at me and said if I reported her or told anyone, she'd claim I taught her how to do it. that I'd shown her how to hide transactions, how to forge signatures, that we'd been doing it together, and I was trying to blame her because I got caught. And you believed she'd do that? I asked, though of course she would. We'd both seen how effectively Samantha manipulated reality. I knew she'd do it, my mother said, her voice breaking, because I'd watched her do it to you. I'd helped her do it to you. I knew exactly how good she was at making lies sound like truth, at making herself look like the victim while destroying someone else. And I was terrified. If she said I'd been complicit in her fraud, my accounting license would be revoked. I could face criminal charges. Everything I'd worked for would be gone. She was crying now, tears running down her face unchecked. So I stayed silent. I let her keep stealing from me because I was too afraid and too ashamed to admit what was happening. And I kept helping her suppress you, because I thought, if I kept her happy, if I gave her everything she wanted, maybe she'd stop. Maybe she'd leave me alone. I protected her out of fear, Melissa. Not love, fear. I sat back trying to reconcile this new information with everything I knew about my family dynamics. My mother wasn't just a willing participant in the conspiracy against me. She was another one of Samantha's victims, trapped by the same fear of exposure and reputation destruction that Samantha had used as a weapon against everyone. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because you deserve to know the truth. All of it. And because I'm done being afraid." She finally looked at me, her eyes red and desperate. "The IRS contacted me yesterday. They want to interview me about Samantha's business practices, about whether I had knowledge of the fraud. And I realized I have a choice. I can keep protecting her out of fear, or I can finally tell the truth about everything, including what she did to me." "You enabled her for 33 years. I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "You helped her keep me invisible. You participated in that recording where you discussed keeping me too busy with family obligations to build a career. You can't just claim you were a victim too and expect that to erase everything you did." "I know," she whispered. "I know it doesn't erase anything. I made terrible choices. I prioritized the wrong things, protected the wrong person, hurt you in ways I can never fix. But I need you to understand that I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to explain why I did what I did. I was a coward. I was weak. And I let my fear of Samantha turn me into someone who hurt her own daughter." I thought about the recording, about how my mother's voice had sounded discussing my suppression. Not gleeful or cruel, but matter-of-fact. Resigned, like she was going along with something she didn't have the strength to resist. At the time, I'd heard it as complicity. Now, knowing what I knew, I could hear the fear underneath. The calculation of a woman trying to protect herself from a daughter who'd already proven she was willing to destroy anyone who got in her way. "Both of us were Samantha's victims," I said, slowly testing how the words felt. "You were just too ashamed to admit it." "Yes," my mother looked at me with something like relief. "I was her victim too. But that doesn't mean I didn't make choices. That doesn't mean I didn't hurt you. I did, and I have to live with that." We sat in silence for a long moment, the coffee shop noise washing over us. I thought about Walter's last words about teaching them grace. I thought about the distinction between understanding and excusing, between acknowledging complexity and absolving guilt. My mother had been victimized by Samantha. That was true. But she'd also made a choice every single day for 33 years to participate in my suppression. Fear might explain that choice, but it didn't erase it. She could have protected me instead of herself. She could have stood up to Samantha 2 years ago when she discovered the embezzlement, or 10 years ago when Samantha stole my business idea, or 33 years ago when the pattern of favoritism first began. But the revelation didn't erase 33 years of choices. Melissa had to decide, was Linda a victim or an accomplice, I asked my mother to meet me at the park where I'd spent my childhood, the one with the rusted swing set and the oak tree where I used to read, while Samantha played with other kids. It felt appropriate somehow having this conversation in the place where the patterns had first been established, where I'd first learned I was meant to be background scenery in my own family story. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on one of the benches near the playground, looking small and fragile in a way that made her seem like a stranger. The powerful, controlled woman who'd run our household with efficient precision had been replaced by someone uncertain and diminished. Part of me felt satisfaction at seeing her brought low. Another part, the part Walter had tried to nurture, just felt sad. I sat down beside her, leaving space between us that felt both physical and metaphorical. For a long moment, we just watched the playground children running and laughing in the afternoon sun, their parents watching from the sidelines, with expressions of indulgent love I'd never seen directed at me. "I've been thinking about what you told me," I said finally, "about Samantha stealing from you, about the fear that kept you silent. And I believe you. I believe you were afraid. I believe she threatened you and manipulated you and made you feel trapped. But Mum, you were an adult, I was a child, and you chose to protect her instead of me." She nodded, tears already starting. "I know. I've been telling myself for years that I was doing what I had to do to keep the family together, to prevent disaster, to manage an impossible situation. But the truth is simpler and uglier than that. I chose wrong. Every single time I had a choice between protecting you or protecting myself, I chose myself." "Why?" The question came out rawer than I'd intended. Why was it so easy to sacrifice me? What did I do that made me so expendable? "You didn't do anything," she said, her voice breaking. "That's what makes it so terrible. You were the good daughter, the responsible one, the one I never had to worry about because you were so determined to earn our love through perfect behaviour. And I took advantage of that. I knew you'd accept whatever scraps we gave you because you wanted to belong so badly. Samantha was demanding and difficult and threatening, so she got attention. You were easy and uncomplaining, so you got forgotten." It was the most honest she'd ever been with me, and hearing her articulate the dynamics so clearly hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated. "Do you hate me?" she asked quietly. I thought about it, really thought about it, examining my feelings with the clarity that months of distance and therapy and journaling had given me. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you. I'm angry at you. I'm hurt by you. I'm disappointed that you weren't strong enough to be the mother I needed. But I don't hate you. But you don't forgive me either," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Not yet," I agreed. "Maybe not ever, at least not in the way you probably want. But I'm working on a kind of forgiveness that isn't about you at all. I'm forgiving for me, so I don't have to carry your burden anymore, so I can put down the weight of waiting for you to finally choose me. Not because you deserve it, or earned it, or because I think what you did was okay. I'm forgiving, so I can move forward without dragging 33 years of pain behind me." She looked at me with something like understanding. "What does that forgiveness look like? What does it mean for us?" "It means I acknowledge that you're human and flawed and you made terrible choices out of fear and weakness. It means I accept that you were both a victim and a perpetrator, that those things can coexist in the same person. It means I'm not going to spend the rest of my life trying to punish you or make you suffer the way I suffered." I paused, making sure she was really hearing me. "But it doesn't mean we have a relationship. It doesn't mean I trust you or want you in my life or that I'm going to pretend the past didn't happen. Forgiveness doesn't mean what you did was okay. It means I won't let your mistakes control my future." "So you're walking away," she said, and there was resignation in her voice rather than argument. "I'm choosing myself," I corrected. "For the first time in my life, I'm putting my well-being ahead of family obligation. If that feels like rejection to you, maybe that's because you've never experienced me having boundaries before." We sat in silence watching those children play, and I thought about the little girl I'd been sitting in this same park trying so hard to be noticed. I thought about how that little girl had grown into a woman who'd learned to make herself invisible just to survive, and how that woman had finally learned she didn't have to stay invisible just because her family wanted her that way. "I'm going to testify against Samantha," my mother said suddenly. "The IRS, the fraud investigation, all of it. I'm going to tell them everything I know about what she did to you and to me. It won't fix what I did to you, but maybe it will prevent her from doing it to someone else." "That's good," I said. "That's the right thing to do. But you should know I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because it's true and because she needs to face consequences." "I know." She looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in my life. "You turned out remarkable, despite us, not because of us. I see that now. I see you now, and I'm ashamed it took losing you completely for me to finally open my eyes." I stood up, preparing to leave this conversation and this park, and maybe this chapter of my life. "I hope you find a way to live with your choices, Mom. I hope you figure out who you are when you're not living in fear. But I can't help you do that. I have my own life to build, my own healing to do. I need you to understand that your journey is yours, and mine is mine, and they don't have to intersect anymore." "I accept." She nodded, accepting the boundary I was setting with more grace than I'd expected. "I understand. And Melissa, thank you for giving me even this much, for not hating me for being better than I was." I walked away from that park feeling lighter than I had in months. The weight of waiting for her approval finally lifted. I'd given her honesty, clarity, and the truth about where we stood. I'd offered understanding without absolution, acknowledgement, without reconciliation. It felt like the right balance, the kind of grace Walter had meant when he told me not to lose myself in revenge. As Melissa walked away from that park, her phone rang. Walter's lawyer, "The will is ready to be read." The will reading was scheduled for the following afternoon at Walter's lawyer's office in Carlsbad, a small firm that specialised in estate planning for elderly clients. I drove down from Oregon, arriving early enough to sit in my car for 20 minutes preparing myself for whatever Walter had planned. He'd been strategic in life, documenting conversations and protecting me in ways I hadn't realised until after he was gone. I had no doubt his death would be equally calculated. The lawyer, a man named Donald Reeves, who looked to be in his 70s, greeted me with genuine warmth. "Your grandfather spoke of you often," he said. "He was very proud of you and very concerned about your well-being. This will reflect that." My parents were already seated in the conference room, along with Aunt Helen, and surprisingly, Samantha. We didn't acknowledge each other beyond brief eye contact. Samantha looked worse than she had at the family meeting, her skin pale, her clothes hanging loose, like she'd lost significant weight. The federal investigation was clearly taking its toll. Reeves began with the standard legal language, then moved to the specifics. Walter's estate, after taxes and fees, amounts to approximately $900,000. The distribution is as follows: $500,000 to Melissa Gray, unconditional and immediate. He looked at me over his reading glasses. "That money is yours to do with as you see fit, no strings attached." I felt tears prick my eyes. $500,000 given freely, with trust and love and no expectation of anything in return. It was everything Walter had been in life, generous and supportive and believing I deserved good things without having to earn them through suffering. "The remaining $200,000, Reeves continued, is to be held in a conditional trust for Samantha Gray." He paused, and I saw Samantha sit up straighter, hope flickering across her face. "The conditions are specific and non-negotiable. Melissa Gray is named sole trustee with complete discretion over distribution." Samantha's expression shifted to confusion, then something darker. "What does that mean?" she asked. Reeves read from the document. "Melissa may distribute the trust funds to Samantha only if all of the following conditions are met. First, Samantha must make a public admission of wrongdoing specifically acknowledging the fraud, identity theft, and systematic harm committed against Melissa. This admission must be genuine and not coerced, issued through a medium of Melissa's choosing. Second, Samantha must complete 3 years of unpaid charity work, minimum 20 hours per week at an organisation serving vulnerable populations. Third, and most importantly, Melissa must genuinely believe that Samantha has changed, that the work of redemption is authentic rather than performative. The room was silent. My mother looked shocked. My father was staring at the table. Samantha's face had gone white, her hands clenched in her lap. If the funds are not distributed within 5 years of Walter's death, Reeves continued, they will be transferred to establish the Invisible Daughters Foundation, a non-profit organisation providing financial support and counselling services to individuals who have been systematically overlooked or abused within their families. Melissa would serve as the founding director. It was brilliant. Walter had created a situation where Samantha would have to choose between money and genuine change, and he'd given me the power to judge which she'd chosen. It wasn't about punishment or reward. It was about whether Samantha was capable of becoming someone different, someone better, and whether that change was real enough to satisfy the one person who'd actually been harmed by her actions. Reeves handed me an envelope. Walter left this for you. He asked that you read it privately. I waited until I was alone in my car to open the letter. Walter's handwriting was shaky but readable, written in the weeks before his death, when he must have known time was running out. Dearest Melissa, it began, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably confused about why I structured my will this way. Let me explain. I'm not testing whether Samantha can say the right words or perform the right actions to get money. I'm testing whether she wants redemption or just wants money. You'll know which. If she comes to you immediately after the will reading, demanding or manipulating or trying to convince you she deserves the money, then she hasn't changed. She's just performing a new role. But if she takes time, if she actually does the work without certainty of reward, if she shows genuine remorse, not because it benefits her, but because she finally understands what she took from you, then maybe she's becoming someone capable of being redeemed. The choice of whether to give her that redemption is yours alone. I trust your judgment completely. You've earned the right to decide who deserves grace and who deserves to face the full weight of their consequences. Whatever you choose, I'm proud of you. Love, always, Grandpa Walter. I sat in the parking lot reading the letter 3 times, understanding the gift he'd given me. It wasn't just the money, though, that would change my life in practical ways. It was the power to decide what happened next, the authority to judge whether Samantha's potential change was worth acknowledging. He'd made me the gatekeeper to her redemption, and in doing so, he'd given me something my family never had the final word. I drove back to Oregon, thinking about those conditions. Public admission of wrongdoing, 3 years of charity work, genuine belief in her change. They were designed to be difficult, but not impossible requirements that would demand real sacrifice and sustained effort. Samantha could meet them if she was willing to put in the work. The question was whether she would, or whether she'd decide the money wasn't worth the humiliation and effort. 2 days later, Samantha appeared at Melissa's door, no makeup, no designer clothes, and said, "Please, one chance to prove I can change." I didn't invite Samantha inside. I stood in the doorway of my apartment above Rose's bakery, looking at this woman who'd spent 33 years making me invisible, and I said, "I need time to think. I'm not making any decisions with you standing in front of me. Go back to San Diego. I'll call you when I'm ready." She'd looked like she wanted to argue, to push to use the manipulation tactics that had always worked before. But something in my expression must have told her that era was over. She nodded and left, and I watched her walk back to her rental car, with shoulders hunched against the Oregon wind. For 3 days, I did nothing but think. I walked the cliffs above the ocean, the same paths I'd walked when I first arrived, broken and invisible. I sat on the driftwood, where I'd written in my journal about choosing silence as a weapon, and I listened to old voicemails Walter had left me over the years, his voice steady and kind, reminding me that I mattered even when my family said otherwise. One message in particular stayed with me. He'd called on my 30th birthday, the one my parents forgot. "Melissa, sweetheart, I just wanted to make sure someone acknowledged this day. You deserve to be celebrated. You deserve to be seen. Don't let them convince you otherwise. I love you and I'm proud of the woman you've become." I played that message a dozen times, crying on the beach, while waves crashed and seagulls called, grieving the man who'd believed in me when no one else would. He'd given me the power to decide Samantha's fate, and I knew he'd support whatever choice I made. But I also knew he'd want me to choose from strength, rather than bitterness, from wisdom, rather than vindictiveness. Ethan found me on the 4th day, sitting at our usual spot overlooking the ocean. He sat down beside me without speaking, just offering his presence the way he always did. Finally he said, "You're thinking about giving her a chance, aren't you?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to tell her no immediately, to make her face the consequences of 33 years of cruelty. But another part remembers Walter's last words. Teach them grace. And I keep wondering if refusing to even consider redemption makes me as rigid and unforgiving as they were." "You don't owe her anything," Ethan said firmly. "She destroyed you systematically. She might have killed Walter. She deserves to lose everything." "I know." I looked at him. "But maybe I owe myself something. Maybe I owe myself the chance to choose mercy over bitterness, to be the kind of person who believes change is possible even when it seems unlikely. Not because she deserves it, but because I deserve to not spend the rest of my life carrying this anger." "That's very evolved of you," he said, and I couldn't tell if he was being sincere or sarcastic. "It's not evolved, it's selfish." I smiled slightly. "I'm doing this for me, not for her. I want to see if I'm capable of offering grace when I have every right to withhold it. I want to test whether I can be better than they were." I called Samantha that evening. "Come back to Oregon," I said. "We need to talk about terms." She arrived the next day, and this time, I invited her inside. We sat at my small kitchen table, the space barely big enough for 2 people, and I laid out my requirements. They were harsher than Walter's will had stipulated, but I figured if she was serious about change, she'd accept conditions more stringent than legally required. First, I said, "You'll make a public apology on television, not social media, not a written statement. A live television interview where you acknowledge everything you did to me, the fraud, the identity theft, the systematic suppression. You'll do this within 30 days or this conversation ends." She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Second, you'll complete 5 years of unpaid charity work, not 3. 25 hours per week, minimum, at an organisation serving vulnerable populations. I'll choose the organisation and you'll provide monthly reports on your progress. If you miss more than 2 weeks in any year, the clock resets to 0. 5 years, she repeated quietly. Okay. Third, you'll move to Oregon. You'll live here where I can monitor your progress, where you can't hide behind distance or perform redemption for an audience back home. You'll find your own apartment, your own job to pay rent, and you'll live modestly. No designer clothes, no expensive cars, no performance of success. I saw her swallow hard at that condition, the reality of leaving her entire life behind, settling over her. But she nodded again. Fourth, you'll meet with me monthly. You'll report on your charity work, your progress, your genuine feelings about the process. And I'll decide whether you're actually changing or just going through motions. If at any point I believe you're performing rather than transforming, this ends immediately and the money goes to the invisible Daughters Foundation. How will you know the difference? She asked, and it was a genuine question rather than a challenge. I'll know, I said simply. I spent 33 years watching you perform. I can recognise the real thing by its absence of performance. She sat quietly for a long moment, processing the enormity of what I was asking. 5 years of her life lived under supervision, in a place where she knew no one doing work that brought her no money or status, all with no guarantee that I'd ever believe her change was genuine enough to release the funds. Why are you even offering this? she asked finally. You could just say no. You could watch me face consequences with no path to redemption. Why give me this chance? Because Walter asked me to teach you grace, I said, and because I want to prove to myself that I'm capable of offering mercy even to someone who hurt me deeply. This isn't about you deserving it. This is about who I want to be. She looked at me with eyes that held something I'd never seen before. Not calculation or manipulation, but something rawer. Fear, maybe, or hope. I'll do it, she said. All of it, for however long it takes. I don't expect you to believe me now, but I'll show you. I'll prove that I can be different. We'll see, I said, and I meant it. I genuinely didn't know if she was capable of the kind of sustained, unglamorous work that real change required. But I was willing to find out. 1 year later, Melissa called everyone to Walter's lakeside cabin for a reckoning that would define them all. Walter's lakeside cabin had been left to me in the will, a small A-frame tucked into the woods 2 hours north of San Diego. I'd spent weekends there as a child, the only place where Walter and I could talk without my family's dynamics intruding. It felt appropriate to gather everyone here for this conversation, in the space where he'd first taught me that I mattered. I arrived early to set up arranging chairs around the old wooden table that had hosted decades of family meals. My parents came first, looking older and more uncertain than I'd ever seen them. Aunt Helen arrived with a casserole because that's what she did in times of stress. Ethan came as my support, sitting quietly in the corner where he could observe without participating unless I needed him. And finally, Samantha arrived, driving the 10-year-old Honda she'd bought with money from her part-time job at a grocery store. She looked different after a year in Oregon. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a simple sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore no makeup. More importantly, she moved differently. Less performance, less awareness of how she appeared to others. She looked tired in a way that suggested genuine work rather than strategic exhaustion. We gathered around the table, and I placed an extra chair at the head, leaving it conspicuously empty. Everyone noticed, but no one asked about it immediately. We made awkward small talk while I served coffee, the kind of stilted conversation that happens when people don't know what role they're supposed to play anymore. Finally, I stood and cleared my throat. Thank you all for coming. I asked you here because it's been a year since Samantha began the work Grandpa Walters will required. A year since she completed her public apology, since she moved to Oregon, since she started her charity work. I've been monitoring her progress through monthly meetings, watching her volunteer at the domestic violence shelter, reviewing her reports. And I've made some decisions that affect all of us. I gestured to the empty chair. This was Grandpa's chair. He sat here for 40 years hosting family gatherings, creating space for all of us to come together. That chair stays empty until I see genuine change, not performance. It's a reminder that the person who loved this family most is gone, and that his absence was partly caused by the choices made in this family. My mother started crying quietly. My father stared at the table. Samantha looked at the empty chair with an expression I couldn't quite read. I've decided to forgive, I continued, and I saw surprise register on everyone's faces. Not because any of you have earned it or deserve it. Not because what happened is okay or acceptable or something we should just move past. I'm forgiving because I deserve freedom from the anger I've been carrying. I deserve to build a life that isn't defined by what was taken from me. Forgiveness is something I'm doing for myself, not a gift I'm giving to you. What does that mean for us? Shus, my father asked, his voice tentative. It means I acknowledge that you're human and flawed and you made terrible choices. It means I'm not going to spend the rest of my life trying to punish you or make you suffer, but it doesn't mean we have the relationship you might want. I looked at each of them in turn. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean I trust you or want you deeply involved in my life. It doesn't mean I'm going to pretend the past 33 years didn't happen or that we're suddenly a happy, functional family. Then what does it mean? Samantha asked, and her voice was genuinely confused rather than challenging. It means I'm choosing not to let your mistakes define my life anymore. I'm choosing to remember that I'm more than what you did to me, that my worth isn't determined by your inability to see it. I'm choosing to focus on building something good rather than dwelling on what was destroyed. I paused, making sure they understood. Forgiveness means I'm putting down the burden of waiting for you to become who I needed you to be. I'm accepting that you are who you are, and I'm moving forward anyway. Aunt Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. Ethan nodded from his corner, his expression proud. My parents looked relieved and disappointed, simultaneously grateful for forgiveness, but sad it came with such firm boundaries. As for the trust funds, I continued looking at Samantha. You have 4 more years to complete the terms. I'm not releasing the money now, and I'm not promising I'll release it then. But I want you to know that over this past year, I've seen moments that gave me hope. The way you stayed late at the shelter, even when your shift was over. The way you talked to the women there with genuine empathy instead of condescension. The way you've lived modestly without complaining or trying to garner sympathy for your circumstances. Samantha's eyes filled with tears. I'm trying. I'm really trying to be different. I know you are. But here's what I need you to understand. Change isn't something you do to get a reward. It's something you do because you realize you were wrong and you want to be better. If you're only doing this work to get the money, then you haven't actually changed. You've just found a new way to perform for an audience. The room was silent, everyone processing what I'd said. My mother looked like she wanted to say something, probably to defend Samantha or to argue that a year of good behaviour should be enough. But she stayed quiet, and I was grateful for that small growth. Samantha looked at the empty chair, then back at me. When will I have earned that chair? She asked. When will you believe I've actually changed? I looked at her, at this woman who'd spent 33 years making me invisible, and 1 year trying to become visible in a different day. And I gave her the answer that I knew would either break her or transform her. Samantha asked, when will I have earned that chair? Man down. Melissa's answer changed everything. When you stop asking that question. 5 years had passed since that moment at Walter's cabin, when I told Samantha that earning redemption meant stopping the performance of earning redemption. 5 years since my story had gone viral and changed my life in ways I never anticipated. And now, sitting at my desk overlooking the ocean in Bayshore, I decided it was time to write one final letter to all the invisible daughters who'd reached out to me over the years. I published it on the same platform where I'd first shared The Invisible Daughter, knowing it would reach the people who needed it most. Dear Invisible Daughters, I began. 5 years ago, I shared my story of being overlooked, diminished, and systematically suppressed by my own family. I told you about disappearing from a life where I didn't matter, and building a new one where I chose to matter to myself. Today, I want to share what I've learned since then, the principles that have carried me from victim to survivor to someone who helps others do the same. I outlined the first principle carefully, knowing it was the foundation everything else built upon. Your worth is not determined by others' recognition of it. For 33 years, I believed I only mattered if my family acknowledged me. I performed and achieved and sacrificed, hoping someone would finally see me. But worth doesn't work that way. You are valuable whether anyone recognizes it or not. Your intelligence, your kindness, your potential, they exist independent of validation. The sun doesn't stop shining because someone refuses to look at it. The second principle was harder to articulate, the one that had taken me years to understand. Strategic silence is strength, not weakness. I spent most of my life being silent because I was afraid to speak up. But when I finally chose silence strategically, when I used it as a weapon, rather than accepting it as a cage, everything changed. The silence at my family's barbecue when I didn't defend myself against mockery wasn't weakness. It was preparation. The silence when I left without explanation wasn't cowardice. It was power. Learn the difference between being silenced and choosing silence. One makes you invisible. The other makes you dangerous. The third principle was about forgiveness, the concept Walter had tried to teach me even as he was dying. Forgiveness frees you, not them. I've forgiven my family, but that forgiveness looks different than most people expect. I'm not having weekly dinners with them. We're not pretending the past didn't happen. I've forgiven them because carrying that anger was poisoning me, not them. Forgiveness means I'm choosing to focus on my future rather than their failures. It means I'm releasing the burden of waiting for them to become who I needed them to be. You can forgive someone and still maintain boundaries. You can release anger without offering reconciliation. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not a gift you give to people who hurt you. The fourth principle was the one that had proven most true over time. The best revenge is living well, not living luxuriously or proving anything to anyone, but living authentically, building something meaningful, becoming someone you're proud of being. My family tried to make me invisible. Now I run a foundation that helps over 500 women annually. They wanted me to stay small. Now my story has reached millions. They tried to suppress my potential. Now I use that potential to help others realize theirs. That's not revenge in the destructive sense. It's revenge in the sense that I became undeniable despite their best efforts to erase me. I wrote about my current life with honesty and gratitude. 5 years after my story went viral, I was running the Invisible Daughters Foundation full-time, funded partly by Walter's Trust and partly by donations from people who'd seen themselves in my story. We provided counselling services, financial support for women escaping toxic family situations, and legal assistance for those dealing with fraud or abuse. Every woman we helped was proof that being invisible didn't mean being powerless. I'd married Ethan 2 years earlier in a small ceremony on the cliffs above Bayshore. He'd stood by me through everything, never trying to fix me or save me, just believing I was capable of saving myself. We'd built a life together that was quiet and ordinary and more precious than anything I'd had before, precisely because it was mine by choice rather than by default. My relationships with my parents existed now, but with firm boundaries. We had dinner once a month, conversations that were cordial but not intimate. I'd learned to accept them as flawed people doing their best, which wasn't very good, but was all they had to offer. My mother had testified against Samantha in the IRS case, which had resulted in Samantha serving 18 months in federal prison for fraud. That testimony had been Linda's attempt at redemption, and while it didn't erase 33 years of choices, it was something. I ended the letter with the words I wished someone had said to me when I was young and desperate to matter. If you disappeared tomorrow, I would notice. Even though I don't know your name or your face or your specific story, I would notice because I know what it's like to be invisible. I know what it's like to wonder if anyone would care if you were gone. And I'm here to tell you that you matter. Your existence matters. Your dreams matter. Your voice matters, even if the people around you have convinced you it doesn't. You are seen. Maybe not by your family, maybe not by the people you wish would see you, but you're seen by me and by thousands of others who've walked this same path. You are not alone in your invisibility. And invisibility, when you learn to wield it correctly, can become the foundation of your greatest strength. Stay strong. Choose yourself. Build something beautiful from the ruins they left behind. You matter. You are seen. The letter reached 50 million people worldwide. But the person who needed it most was sitting across from Melissa at dinner, 5 years older, and finally truly different. Samantha had arrived at my door an hour earlier, carrying a homemade lemon cake, the same kind I used to bring to family gatherings, hoping someone would notice I'd baked to their favourite. She'd made it herself, she told me quietly, following a recipe she'd found in one of Walter's old cookbooks. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, and I suspected it wasn't accidental on her part either, but there was something genuine in the gesture that made me accept it without comment. Now, she sat across from me at my dinner table, the one Ethan and I had built from reclaimed wood, eating the simple pasta dish I'd prepared. She looked nothing like the woman who'd made that cruel joke at the barbecue 6 years ago. Her hair was pulled back in a practical style, greying at the temples in a way she hadn't bothered to cover. She wore jeans and a sweater from a thrift store, clothes chosen for comfort rather than impression. Her nails were short and unpolished, her face free of the carefully applied makeup that had once been her armour. But more than her appearance, it was the way she carried herself that had changed. The performance was gone, that constant awareness of how she appeared to others, the calculation behind every gesture and expression. She moved like someone who'd stopped trying to prove anything, who'd accepted being ordinary and found peace in it. "How's the bookkeeping work?" I asked, making conversation while studying her for signs of the old Samantha, the one who could perform humility as easily as she'd once performed confidence. "Steady," she said. "Not exciting, but honest. I work for a small nonprofit that helps refugees with financial literacy. The pay is modest, but it's enough for rent and groceries. I don't need much anymore." She smiled slightly. "It's strange how little you actually need when you stop trying to impress people." "And the volunteer work?" I knew the answer already. I'd been receiving her monthly reports for 5 years, had even checked in with the organisation she worked with to verify her attendance and attitude. But I wanted to hear how she talked about it, now that the formal requirement was complete. I still go every weekend to the women's shelter teaching financial literacy classes. How to spot financial abuse, how to rebuild credit, how to create a budget when you're starting from nothing. It's the same work I did to meet the trust requirements, but I keep doing it because it matters, because I see myself in those women. The person I was when I thought money and status were the same as worth. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small stack of letters, setting them on the table between us. "These are from some of the women I've worked with over the past 5 years. I wanted you to see them. Not to prove anything, but because I think you'd appreciate knowing that something good came from all this." I picked up the letters and read them one by one. A woman named Carla, who'd left an abusive marriage and used the budgeting skills Samantha taught her to save enough for her own apartment. A 62-year-old woman named Margaret, who wrote, "Your sister taught me I could start over at 50. I thought it was too late to build a life, but she showed me it's never too late to become who you should have been." There were a dozen letters, each one a story of transformation, facilitated by the woman sitting across from me. The woman who'd once stolen my identity and my opportunities was now helping others reclaim theirs. "I don't tell them about you," Samantha said quietly. "About what I did to you, I mean. I don't use your story to make myself look better or to bond with them over shared redemption narratives. But I think about you every time I teach a class, every time I help someone understand how financial abuse works. I think about how I did that to you, how I used your credit and your trust and your kindness as weapons against you. And I try to make sure at least one other person doesn't experience what you did." "That's not the same as undoing what you did," I said, but my tone wasn't harsh. "I know, nothing I do will ever undo it. The best I can hope for is that the person I'm becoming is different enough from the person I was that maybe eventually the scales tip toward more good than harm." She looked at me directly. "I'm not asking you to release the trust funds. I'm not asking you to decide I've earned redemption. I'm just showing you who I am now, 5 years into trying to be different. Whether that's enough is up to you." We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that only comes when people aren't performing for each other anymore. I thought about the monthly meetings we'd had over the past 5 years, watching her slowly shed the layers of performance and calculation, seeing the real person underneath emerge gradually, like a photograph developing. There had been setbacks, moments where I'd seen flashes of the old manipulation, but they'd become rarer over time until they had disappeared entirely. "Tell me about the person you were versus who you're becoming," I said finally. Not a rehearsed answer, just the truth. She set down her fork and thought for a long moment. The person I was believed that worth came from being better than other people. That if you weren't the smartest or the prettiest or the most successful, you were nothing. So I made sure you were nothing so I could be something. I destroyed you so thoroughly that by comparison, I looked accomplished. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. The person I'm becoming understands that worth doesn't work that way. That making someone else small doesn't make you big. That real confidence comes from building something genuine, not from tearing down someone else's foundation. I can't undo who I was, but I can refuse to be that person anymore. It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me, and I believed her because it came with no expectation of reward, no performance of remorse designed to manipulate me into forgiveness. It was just truth, offered without artifice. After dinner, Melissa stood and walked to the empty chair, the one that had remained vacant for 5 long years. I placed my hand on the back of Walter's chair, the wood smooth under my palm from decades of use. Samantha watched me, her expression uncertain, perhaps wondering if this was finally the moment I'd invite her to sit in it to symbolically take Walter's place in our reconstituted family. "Sam," I said, using the nickname I'd avoided for 6 years. "You've worked for 5 years. You've completed every requirement I set, and you've continued the work even after the formal probation ended. You've proven yourself capable of change in ways I honestly didn't think were possible. You've helped hundreds of women, lived, modestly shown genuine humility, and I believe your transformation is real." I saw hope flicker in her eyes quickly, followed by caution. She'd learned not to expect easy resolutions. "But," I continued, and the word hung in the air like a held breath, "this chair stays empty." The hope in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something more complex. Not disappointment exactly, but understanding beginning to dawn. "It stays empty not because you haven't earned forgiveness." I explained, my voice steady despite the emotion underneath. "It stays empty because it reminds us that some things once lost never return. Walter is gone. The man who believed in me when no one else would, who documented truth when everyone else was comfortable with lies, who died possibly because he stood up for what was right. He's not coming back. This chair is his, and it will always be his because some absences are too significant to fill." Samantha nodded slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I understand. Do you?" I asked, not unkindly, "because it's important that you really understand what I'm saying. The years we lost the relationship we could have had as sisters, the trust that was broken when you systematically destroyed my sense of worth for 3 decades, those things don't come back. We're building something new. Yes, you're becoming someone different, and I'm choosing to recognize that transformation. But what we're building isn't a restoration of what was lost. It's something else entirely, something smaller maybe, but also more honest." I sat back down and Samantha remained in her seat across from me, the empty chair between us, a permanent reminder of cost and consequence. "Walter can't come back," I continued. "The innocence I had before I understood how deliberately you hurt me, that can't be recovered. The years I spent believing I was worthless because my own family treated me that way, those are gone. The trust that comes from never having been betrayed, we don't get that. What we're building is different. It's trust that's been broken and carefully, painstakingly rebuilt. It's a relationship that acknowledges the harm done and chooses connection anyway, but it's not the same as if the harm never happened." "I know," Samantha said quietly. "I know I can't undo it. I know the person you could have been if I hadn't spent 33 years destroying you, she's gone. I killed her. And the best I can do is honor her memory by being better to the person you became." It was exactly the right thing to say, and I knew she meant it because it came with no expectation of reward. She wasn't asking for the chair. She wasn't asking for the trust funds or for full reconciliation or for me to pretend we were normal sisters with a normal relationship. She was just acknowledging reality with clear eyes and genuine remorse. "I'm releasing the trust funds," I said, and surprise registered on her face. Not because the chair isn't empty, not because everything is fixed, but because you've met the conditions Walter set and you've exceeded them in ways that matter. The money will go to funding your continued work with abuse survivors. You'll use it to expand the financial literacy program to help more women rebuild their lives. That feels right. That feels like something good coming from something terrible. Samantha stood and I stood with her, and she pulled me into a hug that felt different from any embrace we'd shared before. There was no performance in it, no calculation. Just two women who'd hurt each other in different ways, choosing connection despite the scars. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for the money, for seeing that I changed, for believing I could become someone different." "Don't thank me," I said. "Thank Walter. He's the one who believed in redemption enough to create this path. I just walked it with you." We stood there for a moment, the empty chair beside us, and I thought about everything that had brought us to this point. The barbecue where I'd been mocked, the note I'd left, "I know what you did, Sam," the months in Oregon rebuilding myself, Walter's death and his final gift of power and choice, the viral story that had reached millions, the slow, painful process of watching my sister transform from someone who destroyed me into someone who helped others avoid destruction. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't a switch you flip. It wasn't a single decision that resolved everything cleanly. It was a choice you made every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. The choice to acknowledge the harm without being consumed by it. The choice to see someone's growth without forgetting their history. The choice to build something new while honouring what was lost. The empty chair would remind me of that choice. Every time I looked at it, I'd remember Walter and everything he'd sacrificed. I'd remember the cost of standing up for truth. I'd remember that some absences are permanent, some wounds leave scars, and some relationships are rebuilt rather than restored. But I'd also remember that I was strong enough to choose mercy without forgetting the cost. Strong enough to offer grace while maintaining boundaries. Strong enough to forgive without requiring reconciliation. As Samantha left that evening, the homemade cake half eaten on my counter, I sat at my computer and added one final note to the letter I'd published earlier that day. To all the invisible daughters, I wrote, "You are seen, you always were. Sometimes you just had to disappear to be noticed, and that says more about them than it ever said about you. Your worth was never in question, only their ability to recognize it. Stay strong, choose yourself, and remember the best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so undeniably, authentically yourself that you prove everyone who tried to diminish you was simply wrong. You matter, you always did. And that's where Melissa's story ends, but perhaps yours is just beginning." If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been the forgotten child or the overlooked sibling, if you've ever wondered whether speaking up was worth the cost, I hope this story gave you something valuable. Maybe it's permission to choose yourself. Maybe it's the understanding that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. Maybe it's simply the knowledge that you're not alone in feeling unseen. Melissa's journey from invisible daughter to someone who helps 500 women annually rebuild their lives proves something powerful. The people who try to diminish you don't get to define your worth. Your value exists whether they acknowledge it or not. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to see you and build a life where you finally see yourself clearly. What makes Melissa's story so compelling isn't just the dramatic revelation or the viral moment that changed everything. It's the quiet strength she showed in choosing strategic silence over reactive anger. It's the way she offered grace without sacrificing boundaries. It's how she proved that real revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so authentically yourself that you make everyone who tried to erase you fundamentally wrong about who you were. She didn't need to destroy her family to win. She just needed to build a life so meaningful, so purposeful, so undeniably impactful that their attempts to make her invisible became obviously painfully futile. The empty chair in her home stands as a reminder that some losses are permanent, some relationships can't be fully restored, but healing is still possible. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. It means refusing to let that past control your future. Melissa chose to forgive not because her family deserved it, but because she deserved freedom from carrying that weight. That distinction matters. She wasn't absolving them. She was liberating herself. Think about the 4 principles Melissa shared in her letter to Invisible Daughters. First, your worth isn't determined by others' recognition of it. You don't need permission to matter. You don't need validation to be valuable. The sun doesn't stop shining because someone closes their curtains. Second, strategic silence is strength, not weakness. There's a profound difference between being silenced and choosing silence. One makes you powerless, the other makes you dangerous. Third, forgiveness frees you, not them. It's not a gift you give to people who hurt you. It's a choice you make for your own peace and future. And fourth, the best revenge is living well. Not living luxuriously or proving anything to anyone, but living authentically. Building something meaningful, becoming someone you're proud of being. These aren't just inspirational platitudes. They're battle-tested principles that carried Melissa from being mocked at a family barbecue to running a foundation that changes lives. They're the wisdom she gained from disappearing, rebuilding, and choosing to come back. Not as the person her family tried to make her, but as the person she decided to become. If this story resonated with you, if you saw yourself in Melissa's experience or recognized your own family dynamics in her story, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. This channel is dedicated to stories about resilience, redemption, and choosing yourself when no one else will. Stories about people who faced impossible situations and found ways not just to survive, but to transform their pain into purpose. Every subscription tells me these stories matter, that sharing experiences of overcoming family trauma and rebuilding after betrayal serves a real need in this world. Drop a comment below telling me which part of Melissa's journey affected you most. Was it the moment she calmly raised her glass and said, "Challenge accepted," at that barbecue, showing that sometimes the most powerful response to mockery is quiet determination? Was it the night she drove away at 2 a.m, leaving only that cryptic note that changed everything? Was it discovering the recording that proved the conspiracy was real, that her family had deliberately planned her suppression? Was it Walter's confrontation with the family, knowing it might cost him his life, but doing it anyway because truth mattered more than safety? Was it watching the viral story reach 50 million people and transform Melissa from invisible daughter to voice for millions of others who felt unseen? Or perhaps it was Samantha's slow, painful, genuine transformation over 5 years, proving that even people who've caused tremendous harm can sometimes choose to become different. Your comments matter more than you might realize. They create community for others who've lived similar experiences. When someone reads your comment about being the forgotten child in their family, about having their achievements dismissed or their existence overlooked, they feel less alone. When you share which part of the story resonated with you, you're helping others articulate experiences they might not have had words for. This comment section becomes a gathering place for invisible daughters and sons, for people who understand what it means to be systematically diminished by the people who should have celebrated them. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a friend who's been made to feel invisible in their own family. Maybe it's someone wrestling with whether to forgive family members who hurt them. Maybe it's a person who thinks disappearing from toxic relationships makes them weak, who needs to hear that sometimes walking away is the strongest choice you can make. Sometimes we need to hear someone else's story of survival before we can write our own. Sometimes we need permission from someone who's already walked the path to know that choosing ourselves isn't selfish, it's necessary. Let me know in the comments what lesson from Melissa's story you're carrying forward into your own life. Are you learning to choose strategic silence instead of reactive anger? Are you setting boundaries with toxic family members who've spent years treating you as less than you are? Are you building something meaningful from painful experiences, turning your trauma into purpose the way Melissa built a foundation that helps hundreds of women annually? Are you practicing forgiveness that frees you without requiring reconciliation? Are you learning that your worth exists independent of whether anyone acknowledges it? Tell me your story. Tell me how being invisible in your family shaped you. Tell me about the moment you decided to choose yourself. Tell me about the Walter in your life, the one person who saw you when everyone else looked through you. Tell me about your own journey from invisible to undeniable. Your story matters. Your experience is valid. And sharing it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to find the courage to start their own journey toward choosing themselves. And remember, always remember, if you disappeared tomorrow, you would be noticed. Not by everyone, maybe not even by the people you wish would notice. But you'd be noticed by someone whose life you touched, by someone who sees your value, even when you struggle to see it yourself. You matter. You always did. The fact that some people couldn't see it says everything about them and nothing about you. Thank you for watching, for being part of this community, for choosing to see yourself, even when others tried to make you invisible. I'll see you in the next story, and until then, keep choosing yourself. You're worth it.